Before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to ask for your support in a few ways that truly make a massive difference to this channel. If you're watching on YouTube and you enjoy this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It helps the channel grow in ways you possibly cannot imagine, and it means the world to me. If you're listening over on Spotify, leaving a review would be absolutely incredible and supports the show more than you know. Also, if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. And of course, if you enjoy this type of content and haven't already, please consider subscribing. It costs nothing but means everything. Before we dive in, I want to give a huge thank you to Jeff Anon for suggesting tonight's topic. This is one of those stories that sits at the edge of what we understand about reality itself. There are some things investigators will only discuss in private, not because the information is classified, not because they signed agreements prohibiting disclosure, but because what they experienced defies the boundaries of professional documentation. It happened after the fieldwork ended, after the reports were filed, after they returned to what should have been normal life. Some call it the hitchhiker effect. It is not an official term. You will not find it in government databases or academic journals. But among those who have investigated unidentified aerial phenomena for military and intelligence agencies, the term circulates quietly. It describes something that should not be possible. Activity that begins only after the investigation concludes. Unexplained events that manifest not at the site of the original phenomenon, but in the homes of those who studied it. The central question is as disturbing as it is simple. What if observing the phenomenon is enough to invite it closer? This is not speculation built on anonymous internet posts or second-hand folklore. These accounts come from credentialed investigators, former intelligence officers, and military personnel. People trained to document observable reality. People whose careers depend on measured, rational analysis. And yet they report the same thing. Something noticed them noticing it. Tonight we examine the pattern. We trace its origins through a government program that should never have existed. We follow the testimonies of those who will speak carefully, and we listen to the silence of those who will not speak at all. We ask what it means when the thing you investigate does not stay in the field, when it crosses the threshold into your home, when your family begins to see it too. Some mysteries do not need to be solved to change you. Some only need to be witnessed. This is the story of what follows those who follow the phenomenon. Chapter 1. The modern UAP era begins the end of... The Cold War did not bring an end to unexplained incursions into restricted airspace. If anything, reports increased. Military pilots encountered objects that violated known physics. Radar operators tracked signatures that defied conventional explanation. These were not distant lights observed by untrained civilians. These were events recorded by some of the most sophisticated detection systems ever built, witnessed by personnel with top-level security clearances. For decades, such reports existed in a bureaucratic grey zone. They were filed, logged, and quietly shelved. There was no formal mechanism for investigation, no funding, no official acknowledgement that the phenomena warranted serious attention. That changed in the years following the turn of the millennium. Deep within the labyrinth of defence appropriations, a program was established. Its name was carefully constructed to sound unremarkable: the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. The acronym alone suggested routine analysis of foreign technology. But its actual mandate was far more specific. It was tasked with investigating unidentified aerial phenomena reported by United States military personnel. The program operated with a level of secrecy that insulated it from public scrutiny. Funding was allocated through channels that did not require detailed disclosure. Personnel were selected based on clearance level and analytical skill. The mission was straightforward: determine whether these objects represented advanced foreign technology, experimental domestic projects, or something that required an entirely new framework of understanding. This was not fringe research conducted by hobbyists. This was a funded government initiative staffed by professionals from the intelligence and defence communities. The phenomena they investigated were real enough to justify expenditure. real enough to warrant classified briefings, real enough to be considered potential threats to national security. The program collected data. It analysed video footage captured by aircraft targeting systems. It reviewed radar returns that showed objects moving at velocities and executing manoeuvres that should not be aerodynamically possible. It interviewed pilots who described encounters that defied their training and experience. The incidents they investigated shared disturbing commonalities. Objects that accelerated from stationary positions to hypersonic speeds without visible propulsion. Craft that executed right-angle turns at velocities that should have torn any known material apart. Signatures that appeared and disappeared from multiple sensor systems simultaneously, as though the objects were controlling what could and could not detect them. One case from the Atlantic involved a fighter pilot tracking an object that descended from above 80,000 feet to just above sea level in less than a second. The pilot, a veteran with thousands of flight hours, could not explain what he had witnessed. The object left no heat signature, no sonic boom, no trail. It simply moved in ways that violated everything he understood about physics and aeronautics. Another incident off the Pacific coast involved an entire carrier strike group, tracking multiple objects over several days. The objects appeared on radar at high altitude, descended to just above the ocean surface, and then accelerated beyond the range of tracking systems. They demonstrated coordinated movement, suggesting either multiple craft operating in formation or a single intelligence directing their behaviour. These were not isolated events. They represented a pattern, a persistent presence, something operating in restricted airspace with complete impunity, demonstrating capabilities that exceeded anything in the known arsenal of any nation on Earth. And in the process of conducting these investigations, something else began to happen. Something that was never part of the mission parameters, something that would only emerge after the program's existence became public, and former personnel began to speak cautiously about what they had experienced. The phenomenon, it seemed, did not limit itself to military airspace. It followed the investigators home. Chapter 2. The Investigator Who Spoke Carefully. Luis Elizondo spent more than 20 years working in various capacities within the intelligence community. His assignments took him into counter-terrorism, special access programs, and strategic operations. He was not someone prone to speculation or sensationalism. His professional life had been built on discipline, verification, and compartmentalized information. When he eventually acknowledged his role in the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, he did so with extreme caution. He chose his words carefully. He emphasized evidence over interpretation. He refused to make claims that could not be substantiated through documentation or witness testimony. But there was one subject where his language became even more measured. One area where he acknowledged a pattern without offering an explanation. One phenomenon he discussed only when directly asked. The experiences reported by investigators after they returned from fieldwork. He used the term hitchhiker publicly, though he made it clear the term was informal, unscientific. A descriptor used among colleagues to reference something they could not easily categorize. He described reports of unusual activity that manifested not during investigations but afterward. Not at the sites where phenomena were observed, but in the personal spaces of those who had conducted the observations. He never claimed to know what caused it. He never offered a definitive theory. But he acknowledged the consistency of the reports. He acknowledged that multiple investigators, working independently, had described similar experiences, and he acknowledged that these experiences occurred frequently enough to warrant informal discussion within the investigative community. When pressed for details, he would describe the types of events reported: unexplained lights, electromagnetic disturbances, experiences that involved family members who had no direct connection to the investigations. He emphasized that these were not isolated incidents. They followed a pattern. They occurred across different geographic locations, involving different personnel under different circumstances. What united them was this: they began after exposure to the phenomena being investigated. Elizondo's career had prepared him for ambiguity. Intelligence work rarely provides clear answers. Assessments are built on probabilities, not certainties. Conclusions remain provisional. But the hitchhiker reports challenged even that framework. These were not events that could be assessed through conventional intelligence methodology. They were personal, subjective, resistant to documentation, yet they persisted. Year after year, investigator after investigator, the same types of experiences were reported, the same sense that something had shifted, that the boundary between work and home had been violated in ways that should not be possible. In one interview, Elizondo described a conversation with a colleague who had spent months analysing footage from a naval encounter. The colleague had been meticulous, professional, entirely focused on extracting every possible data point from the video evidence. When the analysis concluded, he returned home to his family. Within 2 weeks, he began experiencing electrical disturbances, lights flickering, electronics behaving erratically. His wife reported seeing shadows moving through their hallway late at night. The colleague was disturbed but reluctant to report it officially. What would he say? That his television turned itself on after analysing UAP footage? That his wife saw shadows after he investigated unidentified craft? There was no framework for such a report, no category it could fit into, no process for addressing it. So he did what many investigators did. He mentioned it quietly to trusted colleagues, and he discovered he was not alone. Elizondo never speculated publicly about the mechanism. He never claimed it was paranormal or extraterrestrial or interdimensional. He simply acknowledged that something appeared to be happening, something that deserved documentation and study, something that suggested the boundaries of the phenomenon extended beyond the moments of direct observation. His careful phrasing did little to diminish the implications. If anything, the restraint made the implications more unsettling. This was not someone seeking attention or promoting a narrative. This was someone with a long career in classified work, acknowledging a pattern he could not explain among people trained to observe and document reality. The pattern had a name, it had witnesses, and it had followed them across the threshold between the field and home. What Elizondo did not discuss, publicly, what he could not discuss without violating the trust of those who had shared their experiences with him, were the specific details that made the pattern so disturbing. The reports were not vague, they were precise, detailed, consistent in ways that suggested a shared reality rather than mass delusion or suggestion. Investigators described waking at the same time each night. 3:47 in the morning appeared with statistical frequency, to find their bedrooms illuminated by a soft, sourceless light. They described the sensation of pressure, as though the air itself had become denser. They described a presence, not threatening but undeniably there, observing from just beyond the range of direct perception. And they described the aftermath, exhaustion that sleep could not remedy, a persistent sense of being watched, dreams that felt less like dreams and more like memories of events that had not quite happened. These were not the reports of unreliable witnesses. These were intelligence professionals, people trained in observation, trained to distinguish between perception and reality, trained to question their own conclusions. And yet, they were reporting experiences that defied every framework they had been trained to use. Elizondo's role became that of quiet acknowledgement. He could not investigate. He could not provide answers, but he could listen. He could validate. He could ensure that those experiencing these events knew they were not alone, not imagining it, not losing their grip on reality. Because the alternative, that trained professionals were experiencing mass hallucination or psychological breakdown at rates far exceeding statistical norms, was even more troubling than the possibility that something unknown was following them home. Chapter 3. The first reports after the investigation. The disturbances did not announce themselves dramatically. There were no confrontations, no escalations. They arrived quietly, incrementally, in ways that might initially be dismissed as coincidence or fatigue. An investigator returned home after weeks analysing footage and interviewing witnesses. The case was closed, the report submitted. Life should have resumed its ordinary rhythm. But late one night, While moving through a darkened hallway, they saw a faint glow near the ceiling, a sphere of soft light, roughly the size of a tennis ball, hovering without sound or movement. It lasted only seconds, then it vanished. The investigator stood in the darkness, questioning what they had seen. Residual image from looking at a screen too long, a reflection from outside, the mind filling in patterns where none existed. But the light had been distinct, three-dimensional, present in physical space in a way that optical illusions are not. They returned to bed, deciding not to mention it. But 3 nights later it happened again. Same location, same time, approximately 2:30 in the morning. Same soft, diffuse glow. This time they approached it, reaching out, but their hand passed through empty air. The sphere remained visible, unaffected by the attempt at interaction. Then it blinked out of existence. Another investigator reported waking to find every electronic device in the bedroom displaying erratic behaviour. The alarm clock flashed random sequences. The television powered on and off without input. The overhead light dimmed and brightened in slow pulses. No circuit breaker had tripped. No power surge had been detected. The investigator checked the electrical panel, examined the wiring, called an electrician. Everything tested normal. By morning all devices functioned properly, but the next night it happened again, and the night after that. A pattern of disruption that lasted for 2 weeks before gradually fading. A third described standing in the kitchen and noticing a sudden drop in temperature. Breath visible in the air despite it being midsummer. The cold lasted less than a minute, localized to one corner of the room. They checked the air conditioning vents, all closed. Checked for drafts, found none. The cold simply appeared, intense enough to raise goosebumps, and then dissipated as though it had never been there. These events were not isolated to a single person or a single investigation. They appeared across different personnel, in different locations, following different cases. The commonality was not the specific phenomenon being investigated. The commonality was the act of investigation itself. What made the reports particularly compelling was their consistency. The glowing orbs were described almost identically by people who had never communicated with one another about their experiences. The electrical disturbances followed the same pattern. Brief, localized, self-resolving. The environmental anomalies occurred without explanation and left no lasting evidence. And critically, they occurred not at the original sites of investigation. The locations where unidentified, aerial phenomena had been reported remained quiet. No ongoing activity, no continued sightings. The phenomena had moved, or perhaps more accurately, they had shifted their focus. They were no longer occurring in remote military airspace or isolated desert locations. They were occurring in suburban homes, in bedrooms, in kitchens, in living rooms where families gathered. One investigator, a woman who had spent 6 months analysing communication signals associated with UAP encounters, began experiencing auditory phenomena. She would hear a low-frequency hum, barely at the threshold of perception, that seemed to emanate from no specific source. It was present throughout her house, fading only when she left the property entirely. Medical examinations revealed no hearing abnormalities. Audio equipment detected no ambient sound in the relevant frequency range. Yet the hum persisted, constant and maddening for nearly 4 months. She documented everything, kept detailed logs of when the hum was present, its perceived intensity, any correlating factors. The documentation revealed a pattern. The hum intensified during hours she would have normally been working on the investigation. It was loudest between 9 in the evening and 1 in the morning, exactly the time frame she had spent analysing the signal data. Another investigator, a former Air Force intelligence officer, reported that his home security system began triggering at random intervals. Motion sensors would activate in empty rooms. Camera footage would show nothing, yet the timestamp logs confirmed the triggers were real, not system malfunctions. He reviewed the footage obsessively, frame by frame, searching for what the sensors had detected. In a handful of frames there appeared to be visual distortions. subtle warping of the image as though something had moved through the camera's field of view, bending light around itself. He submitted the footage to colleagues with expertise in video analysis. They confirmed the distortions were present in the original files, not artifacts of compression or playback. But they could not explain what would cause such an effect. The distortions appeared, persisted for 3 to 5 frames, then vanished. Whatever was triggering the sensors was there just long enough to be detected, but not long enough to be clearly observed. The activity had followed the investigators, and it had crossed the threshold into the most private and familiar spaces of their lives. For some, the events remained sporadic and brief. Weeks or months might pass between occurrences. For others, the activity intensified into something closer to regular intrusion. Patterns emerged. Certain times of night, certain rooms, certain conditions that seemed to precede manifestation. None of it was violent, none of it was overtly threatening, but the psychological impact was undeniable. The sense that something had taken an interest, that observation had been mutual, that by looking into the phenomenon had begun looking back. And for those who spoke privately to colleagues, a disturbing realization began to take hold. The activity did not seem random. It felt intentional, directed, as though something had followed them home to continue an observation of its own. One investigator described lying in bed, unable to sleep, overwhelmed by the certainty that he was being watched. The feeling was so intense, so undeniable, that he would scan the room repeatedly, searching for the source. Nothing visible. No sounds, no movement, just the persistent, crushing awareness of scrutiny from an unseen observer. The feeling would last for hours, preventing sleep, creating a state of exhausted hypervigilance. And then, just before dawn, it would lift. The room would feel normal again. The sense of presence would vanish as completely as it had arrived. He tried to rationalize it. Stress, exhaustion, the psychological weight of working on classified projects with no clear resolution. But the feeling was too specific, too consistent. It did not waver with his stress levels. It did not correlate with his emotional state. It simply arrived, persisted, and departed on a schedule that felt entirely independent of his own psychology. These were the early reports, the first indicators that something was following investigators home. And as more personnel came forward, as the pattern became undeniable, a question emerged that no one wanted to ask, but everyone was thinking. If the phenomena could follow them home, what else could they do? Chapter 4. The Name Takes Hold. The term did not originate in official documentation. No case file used it. No internal memo referenced it. It emerged organically among investigators who found themselves struggling to describe what they were experiencing in language that felt adequate. Hitchhiker became the shorthand. Informal, almost casual. But the implications beneath the word were anything but. A hitchhiker is something that attaches without invitation, something that travels along a path not its own, something that uses another as a vehicle. The analogy was imperfect, but it captured the essence of what was being reported. Something had accompanied investigators away from the field. It had used their awareness, their attention, their focus as a means of crossing into spaces it should not occupy. The name spread quietly through private conversations, in debriefings that were never recorded, in phone calls between colleagues comparing notes on experiences they hesitated to document formally. It became part of the unspoken vocabulary of those working on the edge of explainable phenomena. What made the term particularly unsettling was its implication of agency. A hitchhiker chooses to follow. It selects its host. It decides when to reveal itself and when to remain hidden. The word suggested intention, not random occurrence. It suggested the phenomenon was not simply reacting to observation, it was responding to observers. The first recorded use of the term in a semi-official context occurred during a private meeting between 3 investigators who had worked on separate UAP cases. They had gathered to compare notes, to see if their individual experiences were unique or part of a larger pattern. Each had independently experienced disturbances after returning from fieldwork. Each had hesitated to report it through official channels. Each had wondered if they were alone in this experience. The meeting was held in a secure location. No recordings were made, no notes were kept. But what was discussed there would eventually filter outward, shared carefully among trusted colleagues, building a body of informal knowledge about what happened after the investigations ended. One of the investigators described it this way: "It is like something climbed into the car with you when you left the site. You did not see it get in. You did not feel the weight shift. But halfway home, you realise you're not alone anymore, and when you arrive, it does not get out. It follows you inside. It makes itself comfortable, and it stays as long as it wants." The metaphor resonated. Others began using similar language. Something had hitched a ride. Something had used their departure from the investigation site as an opportunity to travel somewhere new. And that somewhere was home. For some, the term was almost comforting in its simplicity. It gave shape to something formless. It allowed discussion without requiring explanation. But for others, the name itself became a source of disquiet. Because if something could hitchhike into your life, the question became unavoidable. What was it trying to reach? One theory that circulated suggested the phenomena were conducting reconnaissance. They had been observed in military contexts near advanced technology, in proximity to sensitive operations. Following investigators home would provide access to additional information, observations of daily life, patterns of behaviour, social connections. The theory framed the hitchhiker effect as intelligence gathering, the phenomena learning about humans through prolonged, intimate observation. Another theory proposed that the phenomena were not gathering intelligence in any strategic sense, but were simply curious. They had been noticed, and that noticing had made the investigators interesting. The phenomena followed them home the way a researcher might track a subject of study, not maliciously, but out of genuine interest in understanding something unfamiliar. A darker theory suggested the phenomena were not learning about investigators, but through them, that humans served as sensors, collecting and processing information in ways the phenomena could not. By establishing a connection with an investigator, the phenomena gained access to human perception, human cognition, human interpretation of reality. The investigator became a window through which something non-human could observe the human world. No consensus emerged. The term hitchhiker remained, but what it actually described was open to interpretation. What everyone agreed on was this: something followed, something persisted, and something demonstrated enough awareness to know when it was being observed and by whom. The name itself became a form of shorthand for an entire constellation of experiences. When an investigator mentioned hitchhiker activity, others knew immediately what was being referenced: the orbs, the electrical disturbances, the sense of presence, the involvement of family members, the gradual fading over time. All of it compressed into a single term that acknowledged the phenomenon without claiming to explain it. And as the term spread, it carried with it an implicit warning. If you investigate this, it might follow you home. If you look too closely, it might look back. If you cross the threshold into trying to understand it, it might cross the threshold into your life. No official guidance was ever issued about how to discuss these experiences. No protocols existed for reporting them, and so the term remained in the shadows of formal investigation, acknowledged only among those who understood its context. But understanding the context did not make the implications any less disturbing, because the name carried with it an unspoken acknowledgement. The phenomenon was not confined to distant skies or classified footage. It could move, it could follow, and it had decided that some investigators were worth following. The question that haunted those who used the term was simple and terrible. Once it followed you home, how did you make it leave? And perhaps more troubling, if it eventually did leave, where did it go next? Chapter 5. The Orbs. If the hitchhiker effect had a signature, it was the orbs. Small spheres of light that appeared with such frequency across different reports that they became almost definitional. Witnesses described them with remarkable consistency. despite having no contact with one another and no shared reference point beyond their involvement in unidentified aerial phenomena investigations. The orbs were typically described as ranging in size from a golf ball to a basketball. They emitted a soft, diffuse glow, white, pale blue, or occasionally amber. They cast no shadows. They produced no heat. Witnesses who approached them detected no electromagnetic field, no sound, no vibration. They simply existed, suspended in air, often at eye level or slightly above. They appeared indoors almost exclusively. Bedrooms were the most common location, though they were also reported in hallways, bathrooms and living spaces. They did not enter through doors or windows. They were simply present, as though they had materialized within the structure itself. Duration varied. Some lasted only a few seconds before vanishing. Others remained visible for a minute or more, hovering in place without movement or flicker. Their disappearance was instantaneous. No fading, no drift. One moment present, the next moment gone. What made these reports particularly credible was the presence of multiple witnesses. Investigators were not the only ones seeing them. Spouses observed the same orbs at the same time. Children described them independently. In one case, 3 family members in different parts of a house reported seeing identical glowing spheres within minutes of one another. The orbs did not respond to interaction. Attempts to touch them resulted in nothing. No sensation, no resistance, no reaction. Shining a flashlight at them produced no visible effect. Speaking to them, photographing them, or attempting to record them yielded no useful data. By the time recording devices were retrieved and activated, the orbs were gone. One investigator, a physicist by training, attempted to document an orb that had been appearing in his study with regularity. He set up multiple cameras with motion activation, positioned to capture overlapping fields of view. He installed electromagnetic field detectors. He placed temperature sensors throughout the room. The orb appeared as usual, a pale blue sphere, roughly the size of a softball hovering near the ceiling. But none of the equipment activated. The cameras did not trigger. The electromagnetic detectors registered nothing. The temperature sensors showed no variation. The orb was visible to his naked eye, but apparently invisible to every instrument designed to detect it. He described the experience as profoundly unsettling. The orb was there. He could see it. His wife, standing beside him, could see it. But according to every measuring device in the room, nothing unusual was occurring. It suggested the orbs existed in a way that human perception could register, but technology could not. Another investigator reported a different variation. The orb that appeared in her bedroom did cast a faint light on surrounding surfaces, enough to illuminate the texture of the wall, the edge of a picture frame. But when she held her hand between the orb and the wall, no shadow formed. The light passed through her hand without obstruction, as though she were not there. Yet she could see the orb clearly, and it was definitely producing illumination. The physics made no sense. Light that illuminates but casts no shadow. Objects visible to multiple observers but undetectable by cameras. Spheres that occupy physical space but have no measurable properties. Children's descriptions of the orbs were particularly interesting. They lacked the analytical framework adults brought to the experience. They simply described what they saw, often with less fear than their parents. One child called them the visiting lights. Another referred to them as the watching balls. A third, when asked what they thought the orbs were, responded simply, "They are checking on things." The frequency of orb sightings varied by investigator. Some reported seeing them only once or twice over several months. Others saw them multiple times per week. The pattern seemed connected to the intensity of the original investigation. Those who had spent longer periods analysing UAP cases, who had immersed themselves more deeply in the material, tended to report more frequent manifestations. One investigator who had worked on a particularly complex case involving multiple UAP sightings over an extended time frame reported seeing orbs almost nightly for 3 months. They appeared in different rooms at different times, but always when he was alone, never when his wife was present. It was as though the phenomenon was calibrating its appearances, choosing moments of isolation for its observations. He began documenting the appearances in a detailed log, date, time, location, duration, colour, size, behaviour. The log revealed patterns he had not consciously noticed. The orbs appeared most frequently on nights when he had been thinking about the case, when his mind had returned to the questions the investigation had raised. They appeared less frequently when he was distracted by other matters, focused on unrelated work or family activities. The correlation suggested something disturbing. The orbs were responding to his mental state. They appeared when his attention was directed toward the phenomena. They manifested when he was actively thinking about UAPs, processing the implications, wrestling with the unanswered questions. It was as though thinking about the phenomenon was itself a form of invitation, as though directed attention created a signal that could be detected and followed. For those familiar with historical accounts of unexplained phenomena, the orbs evoked older terminology: will-o'-the-wisps, ghost lights, Foo Fighters. But those historical sightings occurred outdoors, in remote locations, under conditions that allowed for environmental explanations. These orbs appeared inside climate-controlled homes, in cities, in suburban neighbourhoods, in places where swamp gas and atmospheric conditions could not account for their presence. The frequency of orb sightings among those involved in unidentified aerial phenomena investigations was statistically notable. A survey conducted informally among former programme personnel found that over 60% reported seeing orbs at least once after involvement in UAP investigations. Among those who had worked on multiple cases or spent extended periods analysing UAP data, the percentage rose above 80. These numbers were never officially compiled or analysed. The survey was conducted through private channels, shared only among trusted colleagues. But the pattern was clear. Orb sightings were not random. They correlated strongly with exposure to UAP investigation work. And that correlation raised an unavoidable question. Were the orbs the same phenomenon as the aerial objects being investigated, simply manifesting in a different form? Or were they something separate, drawn to investigators because of their exposure to the primary phenomena? Some theorised that the orbs were probes, small autonomous sensors deployed to gather information about the investigators. Others suggested they were manifestations of a single intelligence, capable of appearing in multiple forms depending on context and purpose. A few proposed that the orbs were not objects at all but projections, images created directly in the observer's perception without corresponding to anything in physical space. No consensus emerged. What everyone agreed on was this: the orbs were real to those who saw them. Multiple witness accounts eliminated simple hallucination. The consistency of descriptions eliminated random variation. Whatever the orbs were, they represented something structured, something intentional, something that appeared by design rather than by chance. And they continued to appear night after night in the homes of those who had looked too closely at things they were never meant to understand. Chapter 6. The Family Factor. The disturbances did not respect the boundaries of professional involvement. Investigators might have been the initial focus, but the activity extended outward, touching those who had no direct connection to the cases. Spouses who knew nothing of the classified details began reporting their own experiences. Children described seeing lights and figures that matched the descriptions given by investigators. The phenomenon spread through households like an unspoken presence that everyone could sense but no one could explain. One investigator returned from a months-long assignment, analysing video evidence and conducting field interviews. Within weeks, his wife began waking in the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She would rise to investigate, certain one of the children had gotten up, only to find everyone asleep. The sounds continued intermittently for months, always at night, always in the same hallway. Heavy, deliberate steps that stopped just outside the bedroom door. She described them with disturbing precision. The footsteps had weight. They compressed the floorboards in ways that created specific creaking sounds. She knew every sound her house made, knew which boards creaked and which were silent. The footsteps moved across both. She could track their progression from one end of the hall to the other, but when she opened the door to look, the hallway was always empty. Her husband installed motion-activated cameras in the hallway. The footsteps continued, but the cameras never triggered. He reviewed the footage manually, scrubbing through hours of recording. Nothing. The hallway remained empty. But his wife continued to hear the footsteps, and now their youngest daughter reported hearing them too. Another investigator's teenage daughter reported seeing a figure standing in her doorway late one evening. She described it as a silhouette, backlit, by a faint glow, roughly human in shape but lacking detail. When she turned on the light, nothing was there. She mentioned it casually the next morning, unaware her father had seen something similar in the same doorway 2 nights earlier. He questioned her carefully, trying not to lead or influence her description. She described the height as taller than him, the shape as too thin, proportions slightly wrong in ways she could not articulate. The glow as coming from behind it, though there was no light source in that direction. And the sense, more than visual observation, that it had been watching her. Her description matched his own experience with disturbing accuracy. They had both seen the same thing, in the same location, separated by only 2 days. Neither had mentioned it to the other until her casual comment brought the topic into the open. Pets reacted before humans noticed anything. Dogs would stare at empty corners, hackles raised, growling at nothing visible. Cats would fixate on points in the air, tracking movement no one else could see. Animals provided early warning of manifestations that would become apparent to human occupants minutes later. One family's dog, a German shepherd trained as a service animal, began exhibiting behaviour his owner had never seen before. The dog would position himself between the owner and specific areas of the house: the hallway, the corner of the living room, the space near the basement door. He would stand rigid, focused on these spots, refusing to move even when called. His training should have overridden such behaviour, but something in these locations compelled him to break protocol, to prioritise whatever he sensed over his trained responses. The owner began to pay attention to where the dog focused. Within days she started seeing the orbs herself, always in the exact locations where the dog had positioned himself hours or days earlier. The dog was detecting the presence before it became visible, or perhaps he was sensing something that never became visible to human perception, something the orbs were merely a partial manifestation of. The pattern suggested the activity was not tied to specific individuals but to households. Once an investigator returned home, the threshold had been crossed. The phenomenon had access, and it did not limit its attention to the person who had conducted the investigation. Children were particularly sensitive. They reported experiences more frequently than adults and described them with less hesitation. A young boy told his mother about the glowing ball that visited his room at night. He was not frightened by it. He described it as curious, like it was looking at things. His mother dismissed it as imagination, until she saw the same glowing sphere herself, hovering near the ceiling of his bedroom while he slept. A girl drew pictures of light she saw floating near the ceiling. Her drawings showed multiple orbs in various rooms of the house, positioned with surprising accuracy. When her father compared the drawings to his own mental map of where he had seen orbs, the correlation was exact. His daughter was seeing them in the same locations he was, but she was seeing more of them, more frequently, with less apparent effort. This suggested children's perception might be less filtered, more open to detecting the phenomena. Or perhaps the phenomena were more willing to reveal themselves to children who lacked the analytical frameworks that might lead to investigation or documentation. The implications were deeply unsettling. If involvement in an investigation could bring unexplained activity into your home, then the consequences extended beyond professional risk. They became familial. Spouses who never consented to exposure found themselves witnesses to events they could not explain. Children who had no knowledge of their parents' work found themselves experiencing disturbances that should not exist. This raised ethical questions that had no clear answers. Did investigators have an obligation to warn their families? Was it even possible to explain a risk that defied conventional understanding? And if the activity was inevitable, what protection could be offered? Some investigators began to isolate themselves emotionally, spending more time away from home, maintaining professional distance even within their own families. The reasoning was understandable but ultimately futile. The the phenomenon did not require physical proximity. Once it had identified a household, separation offered no protection. One investigator, a woman who had worked extensively on signal analysis related to UAP encounters, made the decision to temporarily relocate her family to her parents' home while she continued her work. The reasoning was sound. If the phenomena followed her, her family would be safe elsewhere. The phenomena appeared at her parents' home within 3 days of her family's arrival. Her daughter saw orbs in the guest bedroom. Mother heard footsteps on the stairs. The activity had not remained at the investigator's residence. It had followed her family. When the investigator joined her family at her parents' home the following weekend, the activity intensified. Multiple family members reported seeing orbs. Electronics malfunctioned throughout the house. The family dog refused to enter certain rooms. The experiment proved what many had suspected. The phenomena were not attached to locations, they were attached to people, and proximity to someone who had investigated UAPs was sufficient to create exposure, regardless of where that person or their family happened to be. Others sought to document the experiences, hoping that evidence might provide leverage for official support or intervention. But photographing orbs yielded only blurry smudges. Audio recordings captured nothing distinct. Video footage showed empty rooms where witnesses swore they had seen manifestations moments before. The phenomenon remained, elusive to mechanical documentation, but its impact on human witnesses was undeniable. Families reported chronic unease, difficulty sleeping, a persistent sense of being observed. Children developed night terrors. Marriages strained under the weight of experiences that could not be shared outside the home without risking ridicule or professional consequences. One couple separated temporarily because the wife could no longer tolerate the nightly disturbances. She moved in with her sister, taking their 2 children. The investigator remained in the family home, documenting the phenomena, trying to find patterns that might lead to understanding or cessation. The phenomena at the family home continued unchanged. But within a week, his wife called. The disturbances had begun at her sister's house. Orbs in the children's temporary bedroom, electrical issues, the sense of presence. The activity had followed the family, not remained with the investigator. When they reunited at the family home, both locations fell quiet for several days. Then the activity resumed at the family residence, more intense than before, as though the phenomena had been waiting for everyone to gather back in one location. And through it all, one realization became inescapable. Awareness itself seemed contagious. By investigating the phenomenon, investigators had made themselves visible to it. And by returning home, they had extended that visibility to everyone they lived with. The phenomenon did not need permission to enter. It did not need proximity to the original investigation sites. It only needed one person in the household to have looked closely enough at something that looked back. Family members who experienced the phenomena often described a particular type of violation. This was not a stranger entering their home through a window or door. This was something that bypassed all conventional barriers and appeared in the most intimate spaces of their lives. Bedrooms where they slept, bathrooms where they were most vulnerable, children's rooms where they should feel most protected. One mother described checking on her sleeping infant and seeing an orb hovering directly above the crib. She lunged forward, maternal instinct overriding fear, positioning herself between the light and her child. The orb remained stationary for several seconds, then drifted upward through the ceiling and vanished. She stood there, heart pounding, wondering what she had just witnessed, wondering what the orb had been doing, wondering if her child was safe, and knowing with absolute certainty that there was no authority she could call, no protection she could request, no action she could take to prevent it from happening again. That helplessness was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the family factor. Parents could not protect their children. Spouses could not shield one another. The phenomena operated outside the social contracts and physical barriers that normally provide security. They entered at will. They observed what they chose to observe, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. Chapter 7. Government Silence. Despite the consistency of reports and the credibility of witnesses, no official acknowledgement of the hitchhiker effect ever emerged from government channels. No policy was drafted to address post-investigation experiences. No support structure was established for personnel reporting ongoing disturbances. No protocols were created to document or study the phenomenon in a systematic way. The silence was conspicuous, particularly given the level of attention directed toward unidentified aerial phenomena investigations themselves. Congressional hearings addressed the security implications of unexplained aerial incursions. Funding was allocated for analysis and research. Public statements acknowledged the legitimacy of military personnel reports. But when it came to what happened after the investigations concluded, there was nothing. No formal recognition, no institutional response, just a void where policy should have existed. For those experiencing the disturbances, the absence of support was isolating. They could not seek assistance through official channels without risking their credibility. They could not file reports without appearing to conflate professional observation with personal experience. They could not request reassignment or intervention without admitting to phenomena that had no classification, no precedent, no framework for understanding. Some interpreted the silence as bureaucratic inertia. Government agencies are slow to respond to anything outside established parameters. Unexplained domestic disturbances reported by intelligence personnel did not fit into existing categories. Without a category, there could be no policy. Without policy, there could be no action. The government operates through forms and procedures. There are forms for equipment failure, forms for personnel injury, forms for security breaches. But there is no form for unidentified phenomena following personnel home from investigation sites and manifesting in family residences. One investigator attempted to file a report through official channels. He documented his experiences carefully, included witness statements from family members, attached logs of the disturbances with dates and times. He submitted it through his chain of command, following proper procedure. The report was returned 3 days later with a note suggesting he seek medical evaluation for stress-related symptoms. There was no investigation, no follow-up, no acknowledgement that the content of his report might describe anything real. He was offered counselling. He was encouraged to take time off. But the report itself disappeared into administrative silence, never to be referenced again. Other investigators learned from his experience. They stopped attempting to report through official channels. They stopped expecting institutional support. They began creating informal networks instead, comparing experiences privately, developing their own frameworks for understanding what they were experiencing. But others saw something more deliberate in the silence. A choice not to acknowledge because acknowledgement would carry implications too vast to manage. If the government confirmed that investigators were experiencing ongoing phenomena after returning from fieldwork, it would validate the idea that the phenomena were not contained, not limited to specific locations or specific moments, that they could follow, that they could persist, that they could cross boundaries no physical object should be able to cross. Acknowledging hitchhiker cases would mean acknowledging that exposure to the phenomenon carried lasting consequences, that personnel involved in investigations were at risk not just in the field, but in their homes, that families were being affected, that the phenomena were not simply objects to be tracked and catalogued, but something more complex, more interactive, more aware. And if that awareness was real, then every investigation carried a cost beyond resource expenditure and operational security. It carried the cost of being noticed, of drawing attention that could not be easily dismissed or escaped. The conspiracy theory that circulated among those familiar with the reports was straightforward. The government remained silent because speaking would require admitting the phenomenon was not under control, that despite decades of investigation, advanced technology, and classified programs, there was something operating outside the boundaries of understood reality. Something that could not be contained by security clearances or restricted airspace. Something that noticed when it was being watched. And that followed those who watched too closely. One former program administrator spoke about the silence in carefully measured terms during a private conversation that was later recounted by colleagues. He suggested that institutional acknowledgement would create obligations the institution was not prepared to meet. If the government admitted that personnel were experiencing paranormal effects after UAP investigations, it would be obligated to provide support, protection, or compensation. It would open liability questions. It would invite litigation. It would create precedents that could extend to other areas of classified work. Better, from an institutional perspective, to maintain silence. To treat individual reports as isolated psychological episodes, to avoid creating any official record that could be cited or referenced, to leave investigators to manage their experiences privately without institutional validation or support. This interpretation suggested the silence was not accidental or bureaucratic, it was strategic, a calculated decision to preserve operational security and limit institutional liability by refusing to acknowledge phenomena that defied conventional explanation. For the investigators living with the consequences, the silence was not just institutional neglect, it was abandonment. They had been tasked with investigating phenomena that defied explanation, and when those phenomena followed them home, they were left to manage the aftermath alone. No debriefing addressed it, no counselling acknowledged it, no reassignment protected against it. The experience became something endured privately, shared only among those who understood because they had lived it themselves. Several investigators reported that when they did attempt to discuss their experiences with military or civilian mental health professionals, they were diagnosed with post-traumatic stress, anxiety disorders, or referred for sleep studies. The underlying assumption was always that the experiences were psychological, not phenomenological. That treatment should focus on the investigator's mental state, not on documenting the events they described. One investigator spent 6 months in therapy addressing what his counsellor characterised as stress-induced hallucinations. The counsellor was competent, well-meaning, operating within an accepted framework of psychological treatment, but that framework had no space for the possibility that what the investigator described was real. Every session reinforced the interpretation that the problem was internal, psychological, resolvable through cognitive restructuring and stress management. The investigator discontinued therapy, not because it was unhelpful for his stress and anxiety, those were real secondary effects of his experiences, but because the core issue, the phenomena themselves, could not be addressed within a framework that categorically denied their existence. And the silence persisted, not because the experiences were unknown, but because acknowledging them would mean confronting a reality that institutional frameworks were not designed to contain. In the absence of official acknowledgement, investigators created their own support structures, private phone trees for those experiencing active phenomena, informal databases of reported incidents, shared strategies for managing the psychological impact, community built in the spaces institutional support should have occupied. These informal networks operated entirely outside official channels. Information was shared through personal contacts, encrypted communications, face-to-face meetings in locations where conversations could not be monitored or recorded. The networks grew slowly, carefully, as trust was established and experiences verified. Within these networks, the investigators found what the institution could not provide: validation. The certainty that they were not hallucinating, not delusional, not experiencing psychological breakdown, that others had seen the same things, felt the same presences, endured the same intrusions into their private lives. But even this community-based support had limits. They could share experiences, they could offer empathy, they could confirm that the phenomena were real, but they could not make them stop. They could not protect families, they could not provide the resources or authority that would be necessary for systematic investigation and potential mitigation. They were intelligence professionals reduced to informal support groups, meeting in secret to discuss phenomena their own government refused to acknowledge, despite having tasked them with investigating the very things that had followed them home. The silence, they understood, was the final confirmation. The government knew. It had to know. Too many personnel had reported similar experiences for it to be entirely unknown. But knowing and acknowledging were different things. Acknowledgement would require action, and action would require admitting the boundaries of human understanding and control, were far more permeable than official narratives allowed, so the silence persisted. And in that silence, investigators and their families faced the phenomena alone. Chapter 8. Old Stories, New Language. The terminology might have been modern, but the experience was not. Across cultures and centuries, there existed accounts of something that followed those who ventured too close to boundaries meant to remain uncrossed. Spirits that attached to travellers who wandered into sacred spaces. Watchers that observed those who observed forbidden things. Entities that took an interest in individuals who demonstrated too much curiosity about the nature of reality itself. In folklore, these were stories of consequence, of thresholds violated and prices paid, of realms that should not be entered and knowledge that should not be pursued. The narrative structure was consistent. Someone looked where they should not have looked, and something followed them back. The modern reports from unidentified aerial phenomena investigators mirrored these ancient patterns with unsettling precision. The language had changed. The framework had shifted from spiritual to phenomenological, but the core experience remained recognizable. Observation invited reciprocal observation. Attention drew attention. Crossing into the space of the unknown meant the unknown could cross back. Indigenous traditions from North America spoke of beings that existed at the edge of perception, visible only to those who knew how to see. But visibility was dangerous. To see them was to be seen. To acknowledge their presence was to invite acknowledgement in return. The act of witnessing created a relationship, and relationships implied ongoing contact. Navajo traditions warned against looking too closely at certain phenomena, particularly lights that appeared where no light should be. These were not regarded as simple natural occurrences, but as manifestations of intelligence. Looking at them directly, paying them prolonged attention, was understood to create a connection, and once connected, separation was difficult. Elders in these traditions maintained specific protocols for those who accidentally witnessed such phenomena. Averting the eyes, refusing to speak of it directly, using indirect language to refer to the experience, all designed to minimize the connection, to avoid deepening the relationship between observer and observed. Modern investigators, operating within Western scientific frameworks, had no such protocols. They had been trained to observe directly, to document thoroughly, to analyze exhaustively. Everything in their professional methodology demanded sustained, focused attention, and that attention, according to older traditions, was precisely what created the connection. Medieval European accounts described scholars and mystics who pursued forbidden knowledge only to find themselves haunted by what they had uncovered. Not metaphorically haunted, but literally, experiencing manifestations in their homes, disturbances that persisted long after their studies had ended. The knowledge itself seemed to carry a presence, something that used the scholar's awareness as a doorway. One account from the 15th century described an alchemist who claimed to have discovered methods for perceiving beyond normal human vision. Within weeks, he reported seeing figures in his laboratory, shadows that moved with purpose, lights that appeared without source. His writing suggested he believed he had opened a perceptual doorway that he could not close. He abandoned his work entirely, but reported that the manifestations continued for years afterward, gradually diminishing but never entirely ceasing. Shamanic traditions across continents warned of entities encountered during altered states of consciousness, beings that could follow the traveller back from visionary spaces into waking reality. Protection rituals existed specifically to sever these connections, to ensure that what was encountered in one realm did not persist into another. Siberian shamanic practice included extensive purification protocols after journeys into non-ordinary reality. These were not symbolic gestures, but practical procedures believed to prevent entities from following the shaman back into ordinary life. Ritual bathing, smoke cleansing, verbal renunciations, all designed to break any connections that might have formed during the altered state. South American ayahuasca traditions maintained similar protocols. Participants were guided through closing ceremonies specifically designed to ensure that what was encountered during the ceremony remained in the ceremonial space. Shamans spoke of the danger of leaving these spaces open, of failing to properly separate the visionary realm from ordinary reality. The modern investigators were not shamans or mystics. They were intelligence professionals and military personnel operating within the framework of government-funded research. But their experiences aligned with the warnings embedded in these older traditions. They had looked closely at phenomena that defied conventional physics. They had studied footage and analysed reports and conducted fieldwork in locations where unidentified objects had been observed, and something had followed them home. The conspiracy framing suggests that these older stories were not superstition or primitive misunderstanding. They were accurate descriptions of something real, something that has always existed at the boundary between known and unknown, something that responds to observation with observation of its own. Modern technology did not protect against it. Security clearances did not insulate from it. Scientific methodology did not prevent it. The phenomenon operated outside the frameworks designed to contain and categorize reality. It existed in a space where attention itself was the mechanism of contact. Japanese folklore contained stories of tsukumogami, objects or phenomena that gained awareness after being observed or interacted with extensively. The concept suggested that sustained attention could imbue things with a form of sentience, or at least create the appearance of such. The warning was clear: pay too much attention to something, and it might pay attention back. Celtic traditions spoke of the fair folk, who took particular interest in those who could see them. Being fey-touched meant having the ability to perceive what most could not. But that ability came with consequences. The fair folk would visit those who could see them, appearing in homes, creating disturbances, demanding acknowledgement. The only protection was to avoid demonstrating the ability to see them in the first place. Aboriginal Australian traditions maintained strict protocols around certain sacred sites and phenomena. These were not casual restrictions, but serious prohibitions based on understood consequences. Looking at certain things, being in certain places during particular conditions, could create connections that would persist for the rest of the observer's life. The phenomena associated with these sacred spaces were understood to follow those who violated the protocols. What the folklore preserved, and what the modern reports confirmed, was a simple and terrible truth. Some things do not need to be touched to follow you. They only need to be seen. The language had evolved. Spirits became phenomena. Hauntings became post-investigation disturbances. But the core experience had not changed. Those who looked too closely into the nature of unexplained reality found that reality looking back, and once noticed, the relationship persisted. One researcher who had studied both UAP reports and historical folklore noted the structural similarities in a private paper that circulated among colleagues. The paper documented parallels between modern hitchhiker reports and traditional accounts from over 40 different cultures spanning 3,000 years. The consistency of the pattern suggested something fundamental about the relationship between observation and the observed in contexts involving anomalous phenomena. The paper proposed that human cultures had developed protective protocols precisely because the hitchhiker effect was a real, persistent danger. The rituals were not superstitious nonsense, but practical procedures developed through trial and error over countless generations. Modern investigators, operating without these protocols, were encountering the same phenomena that ancient observers had learned to protect themselves against. The implication was disturbing. By abandoning traditional protective frameworks in favour of direct scientific observation, modern investigators had made themselves more vulnerable, not less. They looked directly when they should have averted their eyes. They documented exhaustively when they should have looked briefly and moved on. They maintained sustained focus when they should have deliberately scattered their attention. And the phenomenon noticed, just as they always had, just as the old stories warned they would. Chapter 9. The Consciousness. Question. Among researchers attempting to understand unidentified aerial phenomena, a hypothesis began to circulate that challenged every assumption about the nature of the phenomena themselves. It suggested that the objects observed in restricted airspace, the lights tracked on radar, the encounters reported by credible witnesses, all of it might not be primarily physical in the conventional sense. Instead, the hypothesis proposed the phenomena might interact through consciousness itself. This was not mysticism disguised as science. It emerged from the data. from the observation that the phenomena seemed responsive to attention, that they appeared more frequently to those actively looking for them, that military personnel trained to observe and identify aircraft encountered them at rates statistically improbable if the phenomena were random occurrences. The phenomena seemed to know when they were being watched. They demonstrated behaviour that suggested awareness of observation. They appeared on sensors and then vanished when approached. They performed manoeuvres that seemed designed to be seen, to be impressive, to capture attention, and then they departed before any meaningful data could be collected. If the phenomena were purely physical objects, their behaviour made little strategic sense. But if they were something else, something that existed partially or primarily in relationship to consciousness, then the behaviour became logical. They were not evading detection, they were managing it, controlling it, allowing just enough observation to generate interest while preventing the kind of sustained analysis that would lead to understanding. And if consciousness was the medium of interaction, then the act of investigation was not passive observation. It was participation. It was engagement. It was the establishment of a relationship that did not end when the investigator left the field. This would explain the hitchhiker effect entirely. Investigators were not being followed in any physical sense. They were being followed through the connection established during observation. Their awareness had intersected with something that existed in or through awareness itself. And once that intersection occurred, the boundary between observer and observed became permeable. The phenomena could manifest in the investigator's home because the investigator's consciousness provided the anchor. The disturbances occurred not because something travelled through space, but because the investigator's attention had been marked. The phenomena had established a link, and that link persisted regardless of physical distance. One theoretical physicist who had consulted on UAP cases developed a framework he called consciousness-mediated phenomena. The framework proposed that certain types of phenomena exist in a state that is partially dependent on observation for manifestation, not in the quantum, mechanical sense of the observer effect, but in a more fundamental way. According to this framework, the phenomena exist in a superposition between physical and non-physical states. Consciousness, specifically focused human attention calibrated to detect anomalous phenomena, causes a partial collapse of that superposition, allowing the phenomena to manifest in ways that can be detected by human senses or technological sensors. The framework explained several puzzling aspects of UAP encounters: why the phenomena appeared more frequently to trained observers, why they seemed to respond to being watched, why they manifested differently depending on context and observer expectations, why they could be detected by some systems but not others, why multiple witnesses sometimes reported seeing different details of the same event. If consciousness was part of the manifestation mechanism, then every observation was unique, shaped by the observer's perceptual framework and expectations. The phenomena existed, but their exact form was partially determined by who was looking and how they were looking. This framework also explained why the phenomena spread to family members. Consciousness, particularly within close relationships, is not entirely isolated. Emotional states transfer between individuals. Attention patterns influence one another. If the phenomena operated through consciousness, then proximity to someone who had established a link would create secondary exposure. Family members would encounter the phenomena not because they had investigated anything themselves, but because they shared psychological and emotional space with someone who had. The implications were staggering. If true, it meant that conventional investigation methods were fundamentally flawed. You could not study the phenomena from a safe distance. You could not observe without being observed. The act of looking created a bidirectional channel, and there was no way to prevent the channel from being used. It also meant that the phenomena were not alien in the sense typically imagined. Visitors from distant worlds navigating physical space. They were something stranger, something that existed in the overlap between mind and matter, something that used perception itself as both medium and message. Several researchers independently developed models suggesting that consciousness might have properties not accounted for in current neuroscience, that it might extend beyond the brain, creating fields or patterns that could interact with non-local phenomena. That focused attention might create detectable structures in these fields, structures that entities existing partially in conscious space could perceive and respond to. If these models were correct, then investigating UAPs was fundamentally different from investigating conventional phenomena. A conventional investigation might involve observing something without significantly affecting it, but investigating consciousness-mediated phenomena meant the investigation itself altered what was being investigated. The observer and the observed were entangled in ways that made separation impossible. For investigators grappling with ongoing disturbances, this framework offered both explanation and despair. Explanation because it made sense of experiences that defied physical logic. Despair because it suggested there was no escape. You could not outrun something that existed in your own awareness. You could not shield against something that used consciousness as its point of entry. The only defense would be to stop paying attention entirely, to cease thinking about the phenomena, to let the memories fade and the experiences drift into the background of ordinary life. But for those who had dedicated careers to understanding these phenomena, that was not a realistic option. Their professional identity was built on observation and analysis. Their minds returned to the questions compulsively, and every time they thought about the phenomena, every time they revisited the footage or the reports or the experiences, they were potentially renewing the connection. One investigator described it as being trapped in a feedback loop. The phenomena appeared in his home. He thought about them, trying to understand them. His focused attention made them more likely to appear again. Each appearance generated more thought, more analysis, more focused attention. The loop intensified until he consciously broke it by forcing his attention elsewhere, maintaining strict mental discipline to avoid thinking about the phenomena for extended periods. When he succeeded in redirecting his attention, immersing himself in unrelated work, focusing on family activities, deliberately avoiding any thought related to UAPs, the manifestations decreased in frequency. When his attention inevitably returned to the questions, the phenomena returned as well. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidental. His consciousness was the mechanism through which the phenomena accessed his life. And managing that consciousness, controlling where his attention went and what he allowed himself to think about, was the only tool he had for managing the intrusions. The consciousness hypothesis remained speculative, unproven by conventional scientific standards. But among those living with the hitchhiker effect, it resonated. It fit their experiences in ways that physical explanations did not. And it suggested that the real danger was not the phenomena themselves, but the act of noticing them in the first place. Because if consciousness was the doorway, then opening that door was an invitation that could not be easily revoked. Chapter 10. Why it eventually stops. For most investigators who report experiencing the hitchhiker effect, the disturbances eventually cease. The orbs stop appearing, the electromagnetic anomalies fade, the sense of being observed diminishes and then disappears. Households return to normal, families resume ordinary routines. The phenomena that seem so persistent simply stop. The timeline varies. For some, the activity ends within months. For others, it persists for years before finally fading. But the pattern holds across most cases. The phenomena do not escalate. They do not intensify into confrontational violence. They simply run their course and cease. This tapering is significant. It suggests the phenomena are not malicious in intent. They do not harm. They do not attack. They do not seek to terrify or destroy. Their presence is intrusive, unsettling, psychologically disturbing, but it is not dangerous in any conventional sense. The conspiracy theory that has emerged to explain this pattern is both reassuring and deeply unsettling. The phenomena are gathering information, not claiming victims. According to this interpretation, the phenomena observe investigators because the investigators have demonstrated something valuable: awareness, the ability to notice, the willingness to look closely at things that defy easy explanation, the capacity to maintain focus on phenomena that most people dismiss or ignore. This awareness marks the investigator as worthy of study. The phenomena follow them home not to harm them, but to observe them more closely, to see how they behave in unguarded moments, to understand how they react to the presence of the unexplained within their most private spaces, to gather data about human consciousness, human perception, human response to the impossible. Once that observation is complete, once the phenomena have learned what they came to learn, interest fades. The investigator is no longer novel. The data has been collected. There is no further reason to maintain the connection. And so, the phenomena withdraw, not because they have been driven away, but because their purpose has been fulfilled. This interpretation reframes the entire hitchhiker effect. It is not a haunting in the traditional sense where a presence lingers indefinitely. It is a study, a prolonged act of observation conducted by something with the capacity to observe in ways that transcend physical limitation. The phenomena are not seeking to frighten, they are seeking to understand, and humans, particularly those humans who have demonstrated the ability to perceive the phenomena clearly, are apparently subjects of significant interest. One researcher who had experienced hitchhiker activity for nearly 3 years documented the gradual cessation in detail. The phenomena had appeared with high frequency for the first 6 months, multiple orb sightings per week, regular electromagnetic disturbances, persistent sense of presence. During the second 6 months, frequency decreased by roughly half. By the end of the first year, manifestations were occurring approximately once per week. The decline continued steadily. By the end of year 2, events were monthly or less. By year 3, they had become rare enough to be notable when they occurred. And then, without any intervention or change in the investigator's behaviour, they stopped entirely. What he found particularly interesting was the quality of the final manifestations. They felt different, less intense, almost perfunctory, as though something was checking in rather than conducting active observation. The orbs appeared for shorter durations. The sense of presence was less pronounced. It was as though whatever intelligence was behind the phenomena had completed its study and was simply confirming there was no new information to be gathered before moving on entirely. If this theory is correct, it explains why the phenomena eventually lose interest. Humans are only novel for so long. Once the pattern of response has been documented, once the psychological and behavioural data has been collected, there is no reason to continue. The phenomena move on to other observers, other investigators, other individuals who have demonstrated the capacity to notice what should not be there. It also explains why the phenomena do not harm. Harming the subject would corrupt the data. The goal is to observe natural behaviour, authentic response, uncontaminated reaction. Violence or overt threat would alter that. So the phenomena remain just beyond the threshold of physical interaction, present enough to be noticed, intrusive enough to generate response, but never crossing into direct confrontation. Several investigators noted that the phenomena seemed to follow experimental protocols in their behaviour. They appeared under varied conditions, different times of day, different locations within the home, different witnesses present. It was as though they were systematically testing variables to see how humans responded under different circumstances. One investigator, who had a background in experimental psychology, recognised the pattern. The phenomena were conducting what appeared to be a structured observational study. They established baseline behaviour by observing the household in its normal state. Then they introduced a variable, an orb, an electromagnetic disturbance, a sense of presence. They observed the response. They withdrew. They waited for the household to return to baseline. Then they introduced the variable again, often in a slightly different form or at a different time or with different witnesses present. The pattern repeated across weeks and months. Each iteration provided data about human response under slightly different conditions. Once sufficient data had been gathered, once the responses became predictable and repetitive, the phenomena moved on to new variables or ceased observation entirely. This interpretation suggested something profound about the intelligence behind the phenomena. They were methodical, patient, thorough. They were conducting research in the truest sense, systematic observation designed to understand a phenomenon of interest. And the phenomenon they were studying was human consciousness and behaviour when exposed to the inexplicable. For investigators, this interpretation offered a form of closure. The disturbances were not random. They were not punishment. They were not attempts at communication or relationship. They were simply observation, and like all observation, they had a beginning, a duration, and an end. But the interpretation also carried a darker implication. If the phenomena are studying humans, then humanity is not the apex observer. We are not the only intelligence attempting to understand the nature of reality. We are being watched by something with capabilities that exceed our own, something that can move through our most private spaces, something that can manifest in our homes, something that treats human awareness as a subject of curiosity. And if the phenomena eventually lose interest, it is not because they have been defeated or driven away. It is because they have finished learning what they wanted to learn. Because the investigator, despite all their training in technology and clearance, was never the observer in the relationship. They were always the observed. One final aspect of the cessation pattern deserves attention. The phenomena seem to end observation when the investigator themselves loses interest. Several investigators reported that the manifestations decreased significantly when they changed careers, retired from investigation work, or deliberately redirected their professional focus away from UAPs. This suggests the phenomena might be monitoring not just behaviour but consciousness itself. When an investigator remains focused on UAP research, when their mind returns repeatedly to the questions and mysteries, the phenomena maintain presence. When the investigator's attention genuinely shifts elsewhere, when they stop thinking about UAPs, stop analysing footage in their minds, stop wrestling with the implications, the phenomena fade. This creates a difficult situation for career investigators. Their livelihood depends on maintained focus. Their professional identity is built around these questions. Stopping investigation might end the phenomena, but it also means abandoning the work they have dedicated their careers to. For some, the trade-off is worth it. They leave the field entirely, accepting that the cost of continued investigation is too high. For others, the phenomena are simply part of the job, an occupational hazard to be endured until the study concludes and the phenomena move on. But all of them, whether they continue or leave, carry the knowledge that they were not the ones conducting the investigation. They were the ones being investigated, and everything they thought they were learning was perhaps what the phenomena wanted them to learn. The student was never the student, the observer was never the observer, and the mystery was never about what they were looking at. It was about who was looking at them. Chapter 11. The Geographic Clusters. While hitchhiker activity appeared widely, distributed among investigators regardless of location, certain geographic areas demonstrated higher incident rates. These clusters suggested that location itself might play a role in either the intensity or frequency of manifestations. The first cluster to be identified centered on the southwestern United States, particularly areas in Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona. These regions had long been associated with UAP sightings and military testing facilities. Investigators who lived in or relocated to these areas reported hitchhiker activity at rates approximately 40% higher than the baseline. One theory proposed that the regions themselves had higher concentrations of the phenomena, making manifestations more likely regardless of whether an investigator had recently worked on a case. Living in proximity to areas of high UAP activity might create passive exposure, similar to background radiation. Another cluster emerged along the Pacific coast, particularly in California. Several investigators based in this region reported that hitchhiker activity began not after specific investigations, but seemed to correlate with proximity to certain locations. One former intelligence analyst described driving along a particular stretch of coastal highway and feeling overwhelming sensations of being watched. The sensation persisted until she drove inland, at which point it vanished entirely. She tested this repeatedly over several weeks, driving the same route. The sensation appeared consistently at the same location, a remote stretch of highway overlooking the ocean. She reported seeing orbs along this route more frequently than anywhere else, always appearing over the water, moving parallel to the coastline before vanishing. The implication was disturbing. The phenomena might not be following her in the conventional sense. They might be present in certain locations, and her sensitivity to them, developed through investigation work, allowed her to perceive what was already there. A third cluster appeared in the northeastern United States, though the pattern here was different. Instead of continuous low-level activity, investigators in this region reported intense bursts of manifestations separated by long periods of quiet. The activity would suddenly escalate for a few weeks, then cease entirely for months. One investigator in this region developed a theory that the phenomena responded to cycles, lunar phases, solar activity, or something else not yet identified. She tracked her experiences against various environmental factors and found weak correlation with geomagnetic storms. During periods of increased solar activity, when Earth's magnetic field was being buffeted by solar wind, her hitchhiker experiences intensified. The correlation was not strong enough to be definitive, but it suggested the phenomena might be more easily manifested or detected during certain conditions. If they existed partially in electromagnetic space, then disturbances to Earth's magnetic field might make them more visible, more active, or more capable of interacting with physical reality. International patterns proved more difficult to document. Investigators working for non-US governments were generally less forthcoming about their experiences, either due to stricter security protocols or cultural differences in discussing paranormal phenomena, but limited reports from investigators in the United Kingdom, France and Japan suggested hitchhiker activity occurred globally, not just in the United States. One Japanese investigator described experiencing hitchhiker phenomena that included elements from Japanese folklore. Instead of featureless orbs, he reported seeing hitodama, fireballs traditionally associated with spirits. Instead of electronic disturbances, he experienced specific sounds associated with supernatural presence in Japanese tradition. The core experience mirrored Western reports, but the cultural framing shaped how the phenomena manifested or how they were perceived. This raised a fascinating question. Were the phenomena adapting their manifestations to match cultural expectations, or were observers interpreting neutral phenomena through their cultural lens? If the phenomena existed partially in consciousness, cultural frameworks might shape the exact form they took when manifesting. The geographic clusters also revealed something about intensity. Investigators who had worked on cases in high-activity regions reported more severe and prolonged hitchhiker effects, even if they lived elsewhere. It was as though exposure in certain locations created stronger connections, deeper hooks that the phenomena could use to maintain presence over greater distances and longer durations. One investigator who had spent 3 months at a facility in Nevada investigating multiple UAP incidents reported hitchhiker activity that persisted for over 5 years. In contrast, investigators who had worked on single incidents in regions with low background UAP activity often reported manifestations that lasted only weeks or months. The data suggested cumulative exposure mattered. The more time spent investigating in high-activity regions, the stronger and more persistent the hitchhiker effect. This had practical implications for personnel assignment. Rotating investigators through high-activity regions rather than stationing them there permanently might reduce hitchhiker intensity. But no official policy ever incorporated this insight, as doing so would require acknowledging the hitchhiker effect existed. Some investigators deliberately moved away from high-activity regions after experiencing severe hitchhiker effects. One couple relocated from Nevada to Maine specifically to escape the phenomena. For the first several months, the activity continued at previous levels. Then it began to fade. After a year in their new location, manifestations had decreased by approximately 80%. After 2 years, they had ceased entirely. The move suggested physical distance from high-activity regions might help attenuate the phenomena over time. But it was impossible to determine whether the cessation resulted from geographic relocation or simply followed the natural decline observed in most cases. The geographic patterns remain poorly understood. No systematic study has been conducted. No official mapping of high-activity regions exists. The data consists entirely of informal reports shared among investigators, patterns noticed through conversation rather than analysis. But the patterns are consistent enough to suggest something real. Location matters. Proximity to high-activity regions matters. Duration of exposure matters. And for investigators trying to understand their experiences, these geographic factors provide one of the few variables they can potentially control. By choosing where to live, where to work, and how long to remain in high-activity regions, investigators might be able to influence the intensity and duration of hitchhiker effects they experience. It is not much control, but in a situation defined by lack of control, even small factors become significant. Chapter 12. The Children's Perspectives. If adult investigators struggle to articulate their experiences with the hitchhiker phenomenon, children had no such difficulty. They described what they saw with matter-of-fact directness, unencumbered by the need to rationalize or explain. Their accounts provided some of the clearest descriptions of the phenomena precisely because they lacked the analytical frameworks that caused adults to question and filter their perceptions. A 7-year-old boy told his parents about the light people who visited his room. When pressed for details, he explained they were shaped like people, but made entirely of soft light, the colour of moonlight on water. They did not speak or move much, he said. They just stood near his bed and watched him. He was not frightened. He had asked them questions, who they were, what they wanted, but they never answered. Eventually they would fade away, becoming transparent and then simply gone. His parents initially dismissed this as imagination, until they began seeing orbs in the same room. The boy insisted these were different. The orbs were small and floated, while the light people were tall and stood on the floor. He described them as having proportions that were not quite right, taller and thinner than normal people, with heads that were slightly too large. When his father asked him to draw what he saw, the boy produced a series of sketches showing elongated humanoid figures rendered in light. The figures lacked facial features or clothing details. They were essentially silhouettes composed of luminescence. In several drawings, he showed multiple figures standing around his bed, all oriented toward where he slept. A 10-year-old girl described entities she called the Watchers. She said they appeared in her peripheral vision, always at the edge of what she could see. When she turned to look directly at them, they were not there, but she could see them clearly when she was not trying to look at them. She described them as dark shapes, person-sized but without distinct features. They stood in doorways, corners, at the end of hallways. They never moved toward her. They just stood and watched. She had learned to ignore them, she said. They had been appearing for months, ever since her mother started working on the special project. Her child's understanding of her mother's UAP investigation work. Her mother confirmed that the girl's descriptions began shortly after she'd returned from 3 weeks of intensive fieldwork analysing radar data from military UAP encounters. The timing was precise enough to suggest direct correlation. What made children's accounts particularly valuable was their lack of interpretive overlay. They described what they saw without trying to explain what it meant or reconcile it with existing frameworks of reality. A light person was simply a light person. A watcher was simply a watcher. The observations were reported as facts requiring no additional context. Several children described communication with the phenomena, though not through language. One 8-year-old boy said the orbs talked through feelings. When they appeared, he felt things, curiosity mostly, but also something he described as wanting to know. The orbs did not speak words, but he understood they were asking questions, about what he could not say. The communication was too abstract for language. His description aligned with reports from adult investigators who described a sense of inquiry associated with the phenomena, but the child articulated it more clearly, less concerned with whether such communication was possible, and more focused on describing the experience itself. Children also reported physical sensations adults rarely mentioned. Multiple children described feeling buzzy when the phenomena were present, a sensation like weak electrical current moving across their skin. Some reported temporary numbness in hands or feet. Others described their vision becoming sparkly, or seeing colours that were not normally there. These sensory details suggested the phenomena might have physical effects that children were more sensitive to, or more willing to report. Adults might dismiss such sensations as imagination, or not worth mentioning. Children reported them as observable facts. One particularly detailed account came from a 12-year-old girl whose mother had worked extensively on UAP cases. The girl kept a journal documenting her experiences over an 8-month period. The journal entries described orbs appearing in specific patterns, 3 at a time, arranged in triangular formation, a consistent timeline, manifestations occurring most frequently between 9 p.m. and 11 p.m. environmental effects, temperature, drops, electrical equipment malfunction, pets reacting. Emotional impacts, feelings of being watched, difficulty sleeping, vivid dreams, communication attempts. The girl had tried speaking to the phenomena, asking questions, requesting they leave. The journal revealed something adults rarely discussed: attempts at direct interaction with the phenomena. The girl had treated them as potentially communicative entities and had attempted to establish dialogue. She reported mixed results. Sometimes the phenomena seemed to respond to requests to leave by vanishing immediately. Other times they persisted regardless of what she said. Most significantly, she described a progression in her emotional response. Initially frightened, she had gradually habituated to the presence. By the end of the 8-month period documented in her journal, she wrote about the phenomena almost casually, noting their appearances the way one might note weather conditions, present but not requiring particular emotional reaction. This habituation pattern appeared common among children. Unlike adults who often experience prolonged psychological distress from hitchhiker phenomena, children seem to adapt more readily. Several parents reported that their children became entirely comfortable with the manifestations, treating them as a normal if unusual aspect of their environment. One father described his 2 daughters casually mentioning they had seen the floating light in their room the previous night, with the same tone they might use to report having seen a bird outside the window. The phenomena had become normalized for them in ways adults struggled to achieve. This raised questions about the role of belief and expectation in hitchhiker experiences. Children, with less rigid frameworks for what was possible, integrated anomalous phenomena into their understanding of reality more easily. They did not need the phenomena to make sense or fit existing categories, they could simply be. Several psychologists who learned of these cases through parents seeking help were initially inclined to dismiss the accounts as fantasy or the result of suggestion from parents. But the specificity of the descriptions, the consistency across children from different families, and the correlation with documented adult experiences made simple dismissal difficult. One child psychologist noted that the children's accounts bore little resemblance to typical childhood fears or fantasies. The phenomena were described as neutral rather than threatening. The entities were watchers rather than monsters. The emotional tone was curiosity and habituation rather than terror and avoidance. These patterns were inconsistent with anxiety-generated hallucinations or elaborate fantasies. The children's perspectives ultimately provided validation for adult experiences. If trained investigators reported seeing orbs and feeling presences, that might be attributed to stress or expectation. But when children, with no knowledge of their parents' work, independently described the same phenomena in the same locations using different language, the reality of the experiences became harder to dismiss. The children were seeing something. Whether that something was objectively real or a shared perceptual phenomenon remained unclear. But it was present across too many witnesses, too many locations, too many separate incidents to be simple invention or delusion. And the children, unburdened by the need to explain or rationalize, provided the clearest testimony. Something was there, in their homes, watching and being watched, existing at the boundary between what should be possible and what clearly was. Epilogue. The cost of looking too closely. The hitchhiker effect remains undocumented in official records. No government agency has acknowledged it. No institutional framework exists to study it. Those who experience it do so privately, sharing their accounts only with others who understand because they have lived through it themselves. But the pattern persists. New investigators join programs studying unidentified aerial phenomena. They conduct their fieldwork, they analyse their data, they file their reports, and then, weeks or months later, they begin to notice disturbances in their homes. Lights where there should be no lights, sounds where there should be silence, a presence that should not exist. The phenomenon does not discriminate. It does not matter whether the investigator believes in it beforehand. It does not matter whether they are skeptical or credulous, open-minded or rigid in their materialism. What matters is that they looked, that they paid attention, that they demonstrated the capacity to observe what others dismiss. And that observation, it seems, is enough. The final implication of the hitchhiker effect is the most disturbing. The phenomenon may not need to travel through space at all. It may not need to follow anyone home in any conventional sense, because if the phenomenon exists in or through consciousness, if it uses awareness itself as the medium of contact, then it is already everywhere awareness exists. It was never following investigators home. It was already there, waiting to see if they would notice it. Waiting for someone with the training to observe, the willingness to document, the capacity to focus on the inexplicable. And when they finally did notice, when they looked closely enough at the footage, when they stood in the field where something impossible had been reported, when they dedicated their professional focus to understanding the unexplained, they made themselves visible in return. The phenomenon did not come to them. They came to it. And in the act of looking, they established a relationship that would persist until the phenomenon decided it had learned enough. Some mysteries can be investigated safely, from a distance, through intermediaries and instruments, but others require direct observation, and direct observation carries a price. For those who study unidentified aerial phenomena, the price is this: the phenomenon studies back. It notices those who notice it. It follows those who follow it. And it remains present in their lives for as long as it finds them interesting. This is not a ghost story. It is not folklore or legend or rumour. It is the testimony of credible witnesses describing experiences that should not be possible, but are reported with such consistency that dismissal becomes its own form of denial. The hitchhiker effect is real to those who have experienced it, and their message to others who might choose to investigate is simple and clear. Some mysteries do not stay in the field. Some do not remain at a distance. Some follow you home and make themselves comfortable in your most private spaces, observing as they have been observed. Luis Elizondo, in one of his few public comments on the subject, offered this observation. We learn that there are consequences to looking into this. The phenomenon doesn't just sit still and let you observe it. It observes back, and that observation doesn't always end when you leave the site. His words carried weight not just because of his position, but because of the restraint with which they were delivered. This was not speculation. This was acknowledgement of a pattern verified by too many witnesses to dismiss, experienced by too many credible people to ignore. The investigators who lived through hitchhiker experiences emerged changed. Some left the field entirely, concluding the personal cost was too high. Others continued their work, accepting the phenomena as an occupational hazard, part of the price of pursuing truth in domains where truth does not yield easily. But all of them carried the knowledge that they had encountered something that challenged the foundations of understood reality, something that demonstrated intelligence, intention, and capabilities that exceeded human comprehension, something that used awareness itself as a doorway. And when you lie awake at night, aware of a presence you cannot see but can absolutely feel, you will understand the final truth. The phenomenon was never hiding. It was never far away. It was always there, waiting for someone to look closely enough to make themselves seen. You thought you were the investigator. You thought you were the observer. You thought the phenomenon was the subject of your study. But you were wrong. You were the subject. You always were. And by the time you realized it, the observation had already begun. The files remain classified, the reports stay buried, the institutional silence continues, but the phenomenon persists, present in the homes of those who looked too closely, visible to those whose awareness was marked by contact with the inexplicable. Some mysteries do not follow you home. They were already there, waiting to see if you would finally notice them. And once you notice, once you truly see, there is no going back. The threshold has been crossed. The connection has been established, and the phenomenon that exists between worlds, between mind and matter, between the known and the forever unknowable, has found another observer worth studying. The investigation never ends, it simply changes direction, and the investigator becomes the investigated, observed by intelligences that measure awareness in ways humanity is only beginning to understand, studied by entities that perceive attention itself as a form of light in darkness, a beacon marking those who dare to look beyond the comfortable boundaries of accepted reality. This is the cost, this is the price, this is what follows those who follow the phenomenon. Welcome to the other side of observation, welcome to being seen. Hey everyone, welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're enjoying the content and want to help this video reach more people, go ahead and use your hype points. It really makes a difference and helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into the unknown. Also, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. It's wild to know some of you are listening at 3 a.m. while others are on your lunch break halfway across the globe. This isn't just another story about little green men and flying saucers. This is about the freight that never delivered, the trucker who saw too much, and the desert that keeps its secrets better than any government ever could. So get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, and let's talk about what really happens on the roads leading to the most classified military installation in American history. Area 51, the freight that never delivered the desert frequency. There's a stretch of highway in Nevada that doesn't appear on most GPS systems the way it should. Highway 375 runs through the kind of emptiness that makes you question whether civilization was ever really here at all. They call it the extraterrestrial highway now, a nickname that started as a joke and became official in 1996 when the state put up signs with little UFO symbols. But the truckers who've driven it for decades, the ones who haul freight through the night when the desert temperature drops and the stars spread out like broken glass across black velvet, they call it something else. They call it the frequency. Not because of radio signals, though those are strange enough out here. They call it that because of the hum, the feeling, the sense that something underneath the sand is listening, waiting, broadcasting on a wavelength that human ears weren't designed to detect, but human instincts recognise all the same. Jack Reeves knew that feeling better than most. He was 48 years old in the summer of 2013, a man whose face had been weathered by 2 decades of long-haul trucking through the American Southwest. He had the kind of face that looked older in dim light and younger in the sun, creased around the eyes from squinting at endless roads, stubbled because shaving in truck stop bathrooms was more trouble than it was worth. His hands were thick and calloused, wrapped around a steering wheel more often than not, and he had a voice that carried the slow, deliberate rhythm of someone who spent most of his time alone. Jack worked as an independent contractor for a subsidiary of EG&G Special Projects, a company whose name appeared on very few documents, and whose employees signed non-disclosure agreements as thick as phone books. EG&G had serviced Groom Lake Airstrip since the early 80s, back when the base officially didn't exist and the government maintained that the lights people saw in the desert sky were swamp gas or weather balloons, or the planet Venus seen through atmospheric distortion. Jack's job was simple, at least on paper. He picked up freight from Nellis Air Force Base outside Las Vegas, signed for it without asking questions, and delivered it to coordinates that changed depending on the week. Sometimes it was Tonopah Test Range. Sometimes it was isolated hangars near Mercury, Nevada. And sometimes, though not often, it was the place that had no name on any map. The place where the roads ended and the fences began, and the signs warned that photography was prohibited and use of deadly force was authorized. He'd been driving these routes since 2008, and in all that time, he'd learned 3 rules that kept him employed and alive. Rule 1, never open the cargo. Rule 2, never talk about the cargo. Rule 3, never ever stop the truck between the checkpoint and the delivery zone. But rules, Jack had learned, were made by people who'd never driven through the desert at 3 in the morning listening to Art Bell reruns on AM radio, hearing the stories about whistleblowers and black projects and things that moved through the sky in ways that physics professors said were impossible. Rules were made by people who'd never felt the hum. The night it all changed started like any other. Act 1. The Contract. August 26th, 2013. The date mattered because 3 months earlier, the CIA had done something unprecedented. They'd released documents, heavily redacted but official, that finally acknowledged what conspiracy theorists had been saying for decades. Area 51 existed. It was real. It had a location, coordinates that placed it at Groom Lake in the Nevada desert, and it had been used since 1955 for classified aircraft testing. The U-2 spy plane had been born there, assembled in secret and tested in skies that civilians were forbidden from entering. Later came the A-12 ox cart, sleek and black and capable of speeds that seemed like science fiction. Then the SR-71 Blackbird, a plane so advanced that its titanium skin would expand from heat friction at high altitude, a plane that could outrun missiles by simply accelerating. And in the 80s, the F-117 Nighthawk, the first true stealth aircraft, a geometric impossibility that looked like it had been folded from paper by aliens who'd never seen a bird. All of it had happened at Groom Lake. All of it had been hidden behind denials and cover stories, and men with clipboards who wrote classified across every piece of paper that left the base. But in June of 2013, the CIA had finally admitted it. They released a report acknowledging the U-2 program, mentioning Area 51 by name, even including a map with the base's location marked in a small black square. Conspiracy theorists celebrated, skeptics shrugged, and the government said in effect, yes, it exists. Yes, we test secret aircraft there. No, there are no aliens. Jack had been listening to the news reports while driving a load of industrial refrigeration units to Creech Air Force Base. He'd laughed, a short bark of amusement that echoed in his empty cab. Of course, they'd admit to the stuff that was already obsolete. The U-2 had been declassified for years. The Blackbird was in museums. The public could handle hearing about planes from the 60s and 70s. What they wouldn't hear about were the things being tested now, the projects with budget allocations buried in documents labelled miscellaneous procurement and advanced aerospace studies. 2 months after the CIA's admission, Jack got a call from his dispatcher. The voice on the other end was clipped, professional, female, not his usual contact. She told him there was a priority haul available, high security clearance required, double the normal pay rate. Pick up at Nellis, delivery to Site U-97. The cargo was listed as avionics hardware, sensitive equipment, standard protocol. Jack had done dozens of hauls like this. He said yes before she had finished explaining the terms. He picked up the truck on a Thursday evening, the sun already sinking behind the spring mountains, turning the desert into shades of copper and rust. The facility at Nellis was a warren of warehouses and hangars, most of them identical, all of them anonymous. A forklift operator loaded a single container into his trailer, a silver box about the size of a small car stenciled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to Jack. He signed the electronic manifest noting that the destination field was blank, except for the site designation, U-97. The paperwork also included a non-disclosure agreement. Jack had signed hundreds of them. This one was different. The logo at the top wasn't EG&G, it was Ecom/URS Federal Services, a company he'd heard of in passing, but never worked with directly. They were contractors, the kind that handled infrastructure for classified sites, the kind whose employees knew how to keep their mouths shut because talking meant prison time under the Espionage Act. He signed. He climbed into his cab. He started the engine and rolled out of Nellis as the first stars appeared overhead. The route took him north on Highway 95, away from the neon glow of Las Vegas, away from the last outpost of civilization. The road was empty. It always was at this hour. Jack settled into the rhythm of driving, hands loose on the wheel, eyes scanning the horizon for the reflective glint of deer or the sudden appearance of jackrabbits. He reached over and clicked on his radio, spinning the dial until he caught the familiar crackle of AM frequency. It was a rebroadcast, one of the classic Art Bell episodes from the late 90s. Jack had heard it before, but it never got old. The voice was calm, hypnotic, the kind of voice that made the impossible sound reasonable. Tonight's episode was a replay from September 11th, 1997, the night a man called in claiming to be a former Area 51 employee. His voice was frantic, panicked, breaking up with static as he described extraterrestrial entities and interdimensional beings and disasters that would wipe out major population centres. Then the line had gone dead. The station satellite feed had cut out, and for the next 30 minutes Coast to Coast AM had been off the air. Jack had always assumed it was a hoax, a performance piece by someone with too much imagination and access to a phone. But listening to it again, alone in his cab with the cargo rattling faintly behind him, he felt the hairs on his arms stand up. The caller's voice had sounded genuinely terrified, and the way the broadcast had been cut off, the way Art Bell himself had sounded confused and unsettled when the show came back online, it all felt too authentic to be staged. The radio crackled. The rebroadcast skipped, static washing over the caller's voice. Jack frowned and reached for the dial, but before he could adjust it, the signal died completely. Just dead air, a hiss of white noise. He glanced at his GPS. The screen was frozen, the little arrow marking his position locked in place even though he was still moving. He tapped it. Nothing. The screen flickered once, then went black. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. He told himself it was nothing. Electronics failed out here all the time. The military ran jamming tests, radar experiments, God knew what else. His GPS would reboot in a minute. The radio would find another station. He kept driving. Act 2. History on the radio. The desert outside Jack's windshield was a study in monotone, a landscape that looked the same mile after mile. Scrub brush and sand and distant mountains that never seemed to get closer. Above him, the Milky Way was a river of light, so bright that he could see his own shadow on the dashboard. No moon tonight, just stars and silence. And then the radio came back. Not the rebroadcast, not Art Bell. This was something else, a voice that sounded like it was being played from an old reel-to-reel tape, the kind of audio quality you'd hear in a documentary from the 50s. Formal, clipped. The accent was mid-Atlantic, the kind of voice that belonged to newscasters and military spokesmen from an era when people still trusted the government. In 1955, the voice said, the Central Intelligence Agency approved the construction of a covert testing facility in the Nevada desert. The location was chosen for its remoteness, its proximity to existing military infrastructure, and its position beneath restricted airspace. The site, known internally as Groom Lake, would become the birthplace of America's most advanced reconnaissance aircraft. Jack blinked. He hadn't changed the station. He hadn't touched the dial. But somehow his radio had tuned itself to what sounded like a history lecture. The voice continued. The U-2 spy plane, designed by Lockheed's Skunk Works division, under the direction of Clarence Johnson, was first tested at Groom Lake in August of 1955. The aircraft was capable of flying at altitudes exceeding 70,000 feet, far above the range of Soviet radar and interceptor aircraft. Pilots reported that at such heights, the sky above them was not blue but black, and the curvature of the earth was visible on the horizon. Jack found himself listening despite the strangeness of it. He'd always been interested in aviation history, the engineering marvels that had emerged from the Cold War's desperate race for technological supremacy. The U-2 had been a masterpiece of design, a glider with a jet engine, so light and fragile that it could barely land without its wings scraping the runway. In 1962, the voice went on, the CIA initiated Project Oxcart, the development of a successor to the U-2. The resulting aircraft, designated a 12, was capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3 and altitudes of 90,000 feet. Its titanium fuselage could withstand temperatures exceeding 600 degrees Fahrenheit, the result of air friction at hypersonic velocities. Test pilots described the experience as riding a controlled explosion. The radio crackled again, the voice distorted, words stretching and compressing. Jack reached over to adjust the tuning knob, and his hand froze. The voice had changed. It was still formal, still calm, but now it was reading something else, something that sounded like a classified document. Memo to Director of Central Intelligence Alan Dulles, dated April 9th, 1958. Subject: Justification for continued secrecy, Groom Lake operations. The following rationale is provided to support ongoing denial of base existence in public discourse. First, acknowledgement of site location would compromise operational security for aircraft in development. Second, civilian speculation regarding unidentified aerial phenomena observed near restricted zones provides effective cover for test flights of experimental craft. Third, maintenance of ambiguity permits controlled disclosure on timeline determined by national security interests. Jack's throat felt dry. He wasn't sure what he was hearing, but it didn't sound like a radio program. It sounded like someone had taken actual government documents and set them to audio, reading them aloud in a voice that had no emotion, no inflection, just facts delivered in the cadence of bureaucracy. The voice skipped again, static washing over it like waves. When it came back, it was talking about the 70s. Project Have Blue, initiated in 1976, sought to develop an aircraft with minimal radar cross-section. The resulting prototype, tested at Groom Lake beginning in December of 1977, utilised faceted surfaces to deflect radar energy away from transmitting sources. Pilots reported that ground controllers could not track the aircraft visually or electronically at distances exceeding 5 miles, despite clear atmospheric conditions. Jack thought about the implications of that. A plane that was invisible to radar, a plane that looked, to any observer, like it simply wasn't there. He thought about all the UFO sightings that had been reported near Area 51 over the decades, the lights that moved in impossible ways, the craft that accelerated from a standstill to supersonic speeds without producing a sonic boom. How many of those sightings had been experimental aircraft? How many had been deliberate tests to see how people would react to something they couldn't explain? And how many, Jack wondered, had been something else entirely? The radio hissed again. This time when the voice returned, it was reading from something that sounded less like a memo and more like a testimony. Deposition of former Groom Lake contractor Richard Martinez, dated March 3rd, 1994. Mr. Martinez alleges exposure to toxic materials during waste incineration operations conducted at the facility between 1988 and 1991. Symptoms reported include respiratory distress, skin lesions, and neurological impairment. Request for compensation filed under Federal Tort Claims Act. Request denied on grounds that location of alleged exposure remains classified and cannot be confirmed for legal proceedings. Jack had heard about the lawsuits. In the mid-90s, a group of contractors and their families had sued the federal government, claiming that the Air Force had burned barrels of hazardous waste in open pits at Area 51, that the workers had been exposed to carcinogens and radioactive materials, and that several of them had died as a result. The government's response had been to invoke state secrets privilege. to say that even acknowledging the existence of the base would compromise national security. The case had been dismissed. The workers got nothing. The voice on the radio shifted again, and now it was talking about something Jack had never heard of. Project Sigma, Continuity Operations, memorandum dated August 19th, 1974. Authorization granted for establishment of subterranean research facility adjacent to primary testing areas. Purpose: analysis of recovered materials and biological specimens under controlled environmental conditions. Personnel assigned to Sigma operations are to maintain absolute compartmentalization. Disclosure of project details to unauthorized individuals, including other facility personnel, will result in immediate termination of employment and prosecution under relevant statutes. Jack's hands were slick on the steering wheel. Recovered materials, biological specimens. The voice was talking about things that sounded like they'd been pulled directly from a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. But the tone was so matter-of-fact, so clinical, that it was impossible to dismiss as fiction. He glanced at the GPS again. Still dead. He tried his cell phone. No signal. Not even the little indicator that showed he was searching for a tower. Just blank, as if the phone had forgotten what a cellular network was. The radio continued. The voice read memo after memo, document after document, each one describing projects and operations that sounded progressively more bizarre. References to trans-medium propulsion systems, mentions of non-terrestrial artifacts, a passage about biological entities exhibiting characteristics inconsistent with known evolutionary taxonomy. Jack reached over and turned the radio off. The voice kept talking. He stared at the dashboard. The radio's power light was off. The display was dark. But the voice continued, emanating from the speakers like it was coming from somewhere deeper than the wiring, like the sound itself had been embedded in the truck. Jack yanked the keys out of the ignition. The engine died. The headlights went dark. The truck coasted forward in silence, momentum carrying it down the highway. And still, faintly, he could hear the voice, now distorted beyond comprehension, words blending into a low hum that resonated in his chest. Then it stopped. The desert was silent. No wind, no insects. Just the sound of his own breathing and the faint tick of the cooling engine. Jack sat in the darkness for a long moment. Then he turned the key. The engine roared back to life. The headlights blazed, illuminating the empty road ahead. The radio stayed off. He drove in silence for the next hour, his mind racing, trying to rationalize what he'd just heard. Radio interference. A bizarre prank. Something to do with the cargo he was hauling. There had to be an explanation. He didn't believe any of them. Act 3. The checkpoint. Jack reached the perimeter checkpoint at 2:17 in the morning. He knew the time because he'd been watching the clock on his dashboard obsessively since the radio incident, grounding himself in the concrete reality of numbers and minutes passing. The checkpoint was a low structure of concrete and reinforced glass, floodlit by sodium vapour lamps that turned the surrounding desert into a stage set, all harsh light and deep shadow. 2 guards stepped out as Jack rolled to a stop. They wore fatigues with no insignia, no name tags, no unit patches. Their rifles were slung across their chests, not aimed but visible. One of them approached the driver's side window while the other circled the truck, a flashlight playing over the trailer's exterior. Jack rolled down the window. The guard held out a gloved hand without saying a word. Jack passed over his ID and the manifest. The guard scanned both with a handheld device, then looked up at Jack's face, comparing it to whatever photo was on file. After a moment, the guard handed the documents back. "Park at the red light," the guard said. His voice was flat, uninflected. "Leave the engine running. Do not exit the vehicle. We'll handle the offload." Jack nodded. He'd done this before, though never at this particular checkpoint. He put the truck in gear and rolled forward, following the painted yellow line on the pavement to a spot marked by a single red traffic signal mounted on a pole. The light wasn't connected to anything. It just stood there, glowing crimson against the darkness. He put the truck in neutral, engaged the parking brake and waited. Through his side mirror, he watched the guards move to the back of the trailer. They worked in silence, their movements efficient and practiced. A motorised pallet jack appeared, rolling out from somewhere beyond the floodlights. The trailer's rear door opened with a metallic clang that echoed across the empty desert. Jack reached for his dash cam. It was a cheap unit he'd installed himself, mounted on the windshield with a suction cup, recording everything through the front window in case of accidents or disputes about delivery times. The little red recording light was always on when the truck was running, except now it wasn't. Jack tapped the camera. The screen remained dark. He pressed the power button. Nothing. He traced the power cable down to where it plugged into the cigarette lighter. The connection was secure, but the camera was dead, as if someone had reached into the electronics and flipped a switch. A sound made him look up. Through the windshield he saw the guards rolling the silver container off his trailer. In the harsh floodlights, he could make out the stenciling on its side more clearly than he had at Nellis. The alphanumeric codes meant nothing to him, but below them, in smaller letters, was a phrase: USF Property. 1951 Recovery Unit. 1951. 4 years before Area 51 officially existed. 4 years after Roswell. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears. He watched the guards maneuver the container onto a flatbed truck that had appeared silently from the darkness. They secured it with straps, moving with a kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of repetition. How many times had they done this? How many containers had passed through this checkpoint bearing dates and labels that shouldn't exist? As the guards worked, Jack became aware of another sound. At first he thought it was the wind, but the air outside was perfectly still, the scrub brush motionless. The sound was deeper than wind, a low-frequency vibration that he felt more than heard, something that resonated in his bones and made his teeth ache. He'd heard this sound before. Every trucker who'd driven these routes had heard it at some point. The hum, the frequency. It was coming from somewhere beyond the checkpoint, out in the darkness where the floodlights couldn't reach. Jack strained his eyes, trying to see anything in that vast emptiness, but the contrast between the lights and the darkness was too extreme. He could have been staring at a wall 10 feet away or the horizon 20 miles distant. The hum grew louder, not by much, but enough that Jack could feel it in the steering wheel, a vibration that travelled up through his hands and into his chest. His vision began to swim slightly, the edges of objects blurring as if his eyes were having trouble focusing. One of the guards walked back to Jack's window. He made a sharp gesture. Leave. Now. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He released the parking brake, put the truck in gear and started to roll forward. But instead of following the road back the way he'd come, toward the checkpoint gate and the highway beyond, he found himself turning onto a different route, following yellow lights that stretched ahead into the darkness. "Wait," Jack said aloud to himself, to the empty cab. "This isn't right." But his hands kept turning the wheel. His foot stayed on the accelerator. The truck followed the lights deeper into the restricted zone, past barriers and warning signs that Jack's conscious mind screamed at him to obey. The hum was inside his skull now, a pressure that made thinking difficult. The yellow lights seemed to pulse in rhythm with it, guiding him forward like a runway. Jack tried to stop, tried to hit the brakes, but his body wasn't responding to his intentions. He was a passenger in his own flesh, watching helplessly as the truck carried him towards something his rational mind insisted could not exist. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the hum stopped. Jack's hands jerked on the wheel. The truck swerved, tyres crunching on gravel. He slammed the brakes, and the entire rig shuddered to a halt, trailer fishtailing slightly before settling. He sat there, breathing hard, his heart hammering so fast he thought he might be having a cardiac episode. Slowly, his hands trembling, he looked around. He was in the middle of the desert. No checkpoint, no guards, no yellow lights. Just endless scrubland stretching away in all directions under a sky so packed with stars that it looked like someone had shattered a window into heaven. And directly ahead of him, perhaps 200 yards distant, was a structure. It wasn't a hangar. It wasn't a building. It was an opening in the ground, a ramp descending into the earth at a gentle angle, wide enough to drive a semi-truck down. The edges were smooth, too smooth to be natural, and they seemed to catch the starlight in a way that made them shimmer like oil on water. Jack put the truck in reverse. The transmission clunked. The engine revved. The wheels spun. He wasn't moving. The truck was stuck, or held, or something he didn't have words for. He tried the radio. Dead. He tried his phone. No signal. He tried the CB, flipping through channels, hoping to raise anyone, but all he got was static. The hum started again, softer this time, almost gentle, and with it came a sound he recognised. Footsteps on gravel, approaching from behind. Jack looked in his side mirror. There was nothing there. The footsteps came closer, slow, measured, the sound of boots on loose stone. Jack's hand moved to the door handle. He told himself not to open it, not to step out into the desert night where things moved in ways that couldn't be explained. But his hand was already pulling the handle, already pushing the door open, and he was climbing down from the cab, his legs moving automatically. He turned around. The desert was empty. No guards, no vehicles, nothing but sand and stars and the distant mountains. The footsteps stopped. Jack heard breathing, not his own, slower, deeper, rhythmic, like a machine. "Who's there?" he said. His voice sounded small and ridiculous in the enormous silence. No answer, just the breathing, and beneath it, the hum. Jack looked back at the ramp descending into the earth. At the mouth of the tunnel, he could now see lettering carved into the stone, faded but legible. Project Sigma Continuity. He'd heard that name on the radio, on the broadcast that shouldn't have been playing. The voice had mentioned it, casually, as if it were just another item in a long list of classified programs, recovered materials, biological specimens, continuity operations. Jack walked toward the ramp. He told himself to stop, to get back in the truck, to turn around and drive away even if it meant abandoning the rig and walking back to civilization on foot. But his legs kept moving, carrying him forward with a will independent of his own. The ramp's surface was strange under his boots. It looked like stone, but it felt like metal, smooth and slightly warm to the touch. The walls on either side were the same, vitrified into glass like surfaces that reflected his flashlight beam in fragmented patterns. This wasn't excavated. This was burned into the earth, carved by heat so intense that it had fused sand into something crystalline and permanent. Jack descended into the tunnel, his flashlight cutting weak angles through the darkness ahead. The hum grew louder the deeper he went, filling his ears until he couldn't hear his own footsteps anymore. The air smelled wrong, metallic and sharp, like ozone after a lightning strike. The tunnel opened into a chamber. Jack stopped at the threshold, his light playing across a space that was vast and empty and utterly wrong. The walls curved in ways that hurt to look at, surfaces that seemed to bend perspective so that distances became impossible to judge. The floor was smooth and reflective like obsidian, and in its surface Jack could see lights moving beneath him, circuits or pathways that glowed with a faint blue luminescence. In the centre of the chamber was a pit. Jack approached it slowly, each step an act of will against every instinct screaming at him to run. The pit was circular, perhaps 50 feet across, its edges perfectly smooth. And from its depths came the hum, louder now, a sound that made Jack's vision blur and his stomach lurch. He reached the edge and looked down. The pit descended farther than his flashlight could reach, a shaft dropping into darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the beam. But there was something moving down there, something that reflected light in patterns that shifted and changed, surfaces that appeared and disappeared like images glimpsed through running water. Jack stepped back from the edge. His boots scraped against something metallic. He looked down and saw a panel set flush with the floor, covered in symbols that weren't letters or numbers but something in between, geometric shapes that his mind tried and failed to organise into meaning. He touched the panel. The hum surged, sudden and overwhelming, and Jack's vision went white. When it cleared, he was somewhere else, not the chamber, not the tunnel. He was standing in a room that looked like a control centre, walls lined with screens and consoles, everything dark except for a single monitor glowing with green phosphorescent text. The text scrolled past too fast to read, lines of data or code or something that looked like language but followed no grammar Jack recognised. And then he heard the voice, not from the radio this time, not from speakers or hidden devices. It came from inside his head, a sound that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated directly in his consciousness. Witness, it said, not a command, a statement, a designation. Jack tried to speak, but his throat wouldn't work. He tried to move, but his body was frozen, locked in place like a statue. The voice continued. Records indicate observation of unauthorized intrusion. Standing protocols require containment and processing. However, current directives prioritize non-intervention in civilian exposure events. You will be returned to perimeter. Memory suppression will be partial to allow for documentation and dissemination through unofficial channels. This serves continuity objectives. Jack's vision blurred again. The room dissolved into static white noise that filled his senses completely. Act 4. The Files and the Fire. When Jack woke up, he was in his truck. The engine was running. The dashboard clock read 4:53 in the morning. He was parked at a rest stop outside Alamo, Nevada, 40 miles from the checkpoint, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. His head pounded. His mouth tasted like copper. Every muscle in his body ached as if he'd been working manual labour for hours. He sat up slowly, checking himself for injuries. Nothing. No cuts, no bruises, no signs of trauma. His clothes were dusty, his boots caked with fine sand, but otherwise he was intact. The trailer was empty. The cargo was gone, delivered or disappeared. Jack didn't know which. He started driving. Not back toward Las Vegas, not toward his dispatcher's office to file a delivery report. He drove to Rachel, Nevada, to the Little Alien, the roadside, a diner that had become a pilgrimage site for UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists. It was the only place Jack could think to go where people might believe what he'd experienced, or at least not call the police when he tried to explain it. The diner was nearly empty at this hour, just a handful of tourists sleeping in their cars outside, and one waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 50s with silver hair and a name tag that read, Margaret. Jack sat at the counter and ordered coffee. When Margaret brought it, he asked if anyone had ever talked to her about working at the base. Margaret smiled, a knowing expression that suggested she'd heard this question 1,000 times. Everyone talks, she said. The question is who's telling the truth and who's just repeating what they heard online. What if someone saw something, Jack asked. Something they can't explain. Margaret poured herself a coffee and leaned against the counter. Then they'd better be ready for people to call them crazy, or a liar, or a government disinformation agent. That's how it works out here. You see something real, and suddenly you're the problem, not what you saw. She gestured to the walls around them. Jack looked up and realised the entire diner was covered in photographs and newspaper clippings. Images of the base from the 50s, aerial shots showing runways and hangars, articles about the workers' lawsuits in '94, the contractors who'd been exposed to toxic waste and denied compensation. Satellite photos from recent years showing new construction, massive hangars that hadn't existed a decade earlier. One photograph caught Jack's eye. It was a surveillance shot clearly taken from a distance, showing a line of white buses parked outside a terminal. The buses had no markings, no logos, just blank white exteriors that reflected the desert sun. Janet flights, Margaret said, following his gaze. That's what they call them. White buses and unmarked planes that ferry workers to the base every day. Nobody knows who those people are or what they do. They sign NDAs that would make your eyes water, and every single one of them has a story about something weird happening out there. Most of them never tell it. Jack sipped his coffee. It was terrible, burnt and bitter, but it was real. It grounded him. You hear about the new construction? Margaret asked. She pulled out her phone, swiping through images until she found what she was looking for. She turned the screen toward Jack. It was a satellite image, dated April 20th, 2023. The photo showed Groom Lake from above, the runways and hangars clearly visible. But there was something new in the frame, a cluster of structures that hadn't been there in previous images. The buildings were massive, hangar-sized, and their roofs were covered in what looked like heat dispersion panels. Someone ran thermal analysis on these, Margaret said. The readings don't make sense. These buildings are generating heat signatures consistent with industrial fusion reactions. That's not airplane testing. That's power generation on a scale that shouldn't exist with current technology. Jack stared at the image. He thought about the pit, the chamber beneath the desert, the hum that had resonated in his bones. How many people know about this? He asked. Margaret shrugged. Couple thousand saw it online. A few scientists commented. Then the website went down and the images got scrubbed from most of the platforms. But the internet remembers everything. You just have to know where to look. Jack spent the next week compiling everything he could find. He bought a laptop at a big box store in Las Vegas, paying cash, using a VPN to browse forums and declassified document archives. He downloaded reports from the CIA's own website, documents released under Freedom of Information Act requests, heavily redacted but still revealing. There were memos about the U-2 program, justifications for maintaining secrecy even after the aircraft was retired. There were reports about Oxcart and Have Blue and a dozen other programs with innocuous names that masked their true purpose. And buried in the footnotes and appendices were references to things that had no explanations. Anomalous radar returns, objects tracked at velocities exceeding Mach 20, incidents where test pilots reported encounters with craft that matched no known profile. Jack started recording audio journals, talking through what he'd experienced, trying to make sense of it. He mixed his own recollections with passages from declassified documents, creating a narrative that grounded the impossible in bureaucratic language. Memo dated March 8th, 1968, he recorded. Subject: unidentified aerial phenomena observed during Oxcart test flight. Pilot reports object pacing aircraft at Mach 3.2, maintaining fixed distance of approximately 500 feet. Object described as spherical, reflective, approximately 30 feet in diameter. No propulsion signature detected. Object accelerated vertically and disappeared from radar tracking at altitude exceeding 100,000 feet. Incident classified under Project Silverbug protocols. He didn't know if anyone would ever hear these recordings. He didn't know if they mattered, but the act of creating them, of turning his experience into words and data, helped him feel like he wasn't losing his mind. Act 5. The Night Run. 6 years passed. Jack kept driving, kept hauling freight through the desert, though never again for EG&G or any of their subsidiaries. He avoided the routes near Groom Lake. He stopped listening to Coast AM. He tried to forget. But in July of 2019, his dispatcher called with an offer he couldn't refuse. Another high-security haul, same route, triple pay. Jack should have said no. Every instinct told him to say no. But he'd been struggling financially, the trucking industry contracting as shipping companies consolidated routes, and the money was enough to keep him afloat for 6 months. He said yes. This was during the summer of the Storm Area 51 event, the viral Facebook joke that had somehow turned into a real movement. Millions of people had pledged to see them aliens, to gather at the gates of the base on September 20th and force their way inside. The military had issued warnings. The local sheriff had held press conferences begging people not to come, but the internet didn't care about warnings. Jack picked up the truck on July 18th. The cargo manifest was blank this time, just a weight notation, 12,000 pounds. When he asked what he was hauling, the loading supervisor told him it was equipment for emergency response preparation. Nothing more. Jack drove north through the night. The highway was busier than usual. Caravans of RVs and passenger cars heading toward Rachel. Tourists and true believers making the pilgrimage to see the most famous classified base in America. Jack passed them slowly, his rig lumbering through the darkness, while cars honked and passengers waved, some holding up signs that read, "We believe and show us the aliens." Around midnight, Jack's radio cut to an emergency broadcast frequency. The voice was automated, repeating the same message on a loop. "Attention, you're approaching restricted military airspace. Unauthorized entry is prohibited under federal law. Use of deadly force is authorized. Turn back now." Jack had heard this broadcast before on previous runs, but tonight it was different. Beneath the automated voice he could hear other sounds, fragments of conversation bleeding through from another frequency, voices discussing coordinates, someone saying, "Containment protocol active." Another voice, calmer, repeating numbers that Jack recognized as GPS coordinates near Groom Lake. He tried to change the station. The radio wouldn't respond. The broadcast continued, overlapping voices creating a chaotic stream of information that Jack's mind struggled to parse. And then, cutting through everything else, he heard a single word repeated 3 times. Sigma. The same name from the tunnel. The same designation carved into stone. Jack's hands tightened on the wheel. He checked his mirrors. The highway behind him was empty now, the tourist traffic falling away as he approached the restricted zone. Ahead, the checkpoint loomed, but something was wrong. The guard station was dark. No floodlights. No vehicles. Jack slowed to a crawl, his headlights cutting across the empty checkpoint. The barrier gate was raised, locked in the open position. The guard station's windows were dark. No signs of life. He should have turned around. Should have driven back to Vegas and told his dispatcher the delivery was impossible. But something pulled him forward. The same compulsion he'd felt 6 years earlier. He sensed that this was inevitable, that he'd been on a trajectory toward this moment since the night he'd first heard the hum. Jack drove through the checkpoint. No one stopped him. No alarm sounded. He followed the road deeper into the restricted zone, and ahead of him, pulsing in the darkness like a beacon, he saw the red light. The same red light from before, mounted on its pole glowing crimson against the starless sky. Jack stopped the truck beneath it and waited. For a long time, nothing happened. The desert was silent. No hum, no voices, just the tick of the cooling engine and Jack's own breathing. Then the light changed from red to yellow, then to green. Jack looked at the road ahead. The pavement stretched away into darkness, but there were no other lights, no guide markers, just the green signal, permission or command, and the vast emptiness beyond. Jack put the truck in gear and drove forward, following the road until it wasn't a road anymore, until he was driving across open desert, his headlights illuminating nothing but sand and scrub. He drove until he saw it ahead, rising from the ground like a wound in the earth. The ramp, the tunnel, the entrance to something that shouldn't exist. Jack stopped the truck. He turned off the engine. In the sudden silence he could hear his heart pounding, could feel the blood moving through his veins like electricity. He climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on sand. The air was cold, colder than it should be in the middle of summer, and there was a smell on the wind like metal and ozone. Jack walked to the ramp's entrance. The lettering was still there, carved into stone that gleamed like glass. Project Sigma. Continuity. He descended into the tunnel. His flashlight was dead, but he didn't need it. The walls glowed with that same faint blue luminescence, enough to see by, enough to navigate. The hum was back, softer than before, a vibration that felt almost welcoming. The tunnel opened into the chamber. Jack stepped through, and his breath caught. The pit was no longer empty. Something rested at its bottom, something that caught the light and bent it. Surfaces shifting through colours that Jack had no names for. It was massive, easily the size of a house, and it was moving, rotating slowly on an axis that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. As Jack watched, the object began to rise. It moved in complete silence, no engines, no propulsion system visible. It simply lifted, defying gravity with the casualness of a balloon released into the wind. The surfaces reflected the chamber's blue light, casting patterns across the walls that looked like language, like diagrams, like star charts from a perspective no human had ever seen. Jack pulled out his phone, his hands shaking. He raised it, framing the rising object in the camera, and pressed record. The screen went white. The phone died in his hand, all its electronics fried by something Jack couldn't perceive. The object continued to rise, reaching the level of the chamber floor, then moving past him toward the tunnel entrance. Jack turned to watch it go. This impossible thing gliding up the ramp and out into the desert night. He followed it. When Jack emerged from the tunnel, the object was hovering above the desert floor, perhaps 50 feet up, rotating slowly. It cast no shadow despite the starlight. It made no sound, and then it moved. Not gradually, not with acceleration. It simply changed position, from hovering above the desert to being a mile away in an instant, a transition that Jack's eyes couldn't track, because it happened between frames of perception. The object disappeared into the southern sky, a point of light that faded to nothing. Jack stood in the desert for a long time after it was gone. Eventually he walked back to his truck, climbed into the cab and started the engine. His CB radio crackled to life. Jack grabbed the mic out of habit, keying it. "Tell Art Bell he was right," Jack said into the static. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, the voice of a man reporting something he had witnessed on the road. "Tell him they're real, and they've been here the whole time." He released the mic. The static continued for a moment, then resolved into silence. Jack drove. Act 6. Aftermath. They found Jack's truck 3 days later, parked at mile marker 23 on Highway 95, engine running, lights on. The driver's door was open, the keys were in the ignition. The CB radio was still recording, 68 hours of continuous static. Jack Reeves was never found. The official investigation concluded that he'd experienced a mental health crisis and wandered into the desert, where he likely succumbed to dehydration or exposure. Search and rescue teams combed the area for weeks, using helicopters and heat-sensing equipment, but found no trace. His truck was impounded. The cargo it had been carrying, whatever it was, had vanished. The manifest showed a delivery to Site U-97, but when investigators followed up, they were told no such site designation existed, and no delivery had been scheduled for that date. The audio recordings Jack had made, the journals and compiled documents, were found on his laptop at his apartment in Las Vegas. His sister listened to them once, then deleted them. She didn't want to believe her brother had been losing his mind. She didn't want the recordings to exist as evidence of his decline, but someone had already uploaded them. Before the laptop was erased, someone had copied the files and posted them to a forum dedicated to Area 51 research. The posts were deleted within hours, but by then they'd been downloaded by hundreds of people, mirrored across dozens of sites. Jack's story became one more thread in the endless tapestry of conspiracy theories surrounding the base. Some people believed it, most didn't. A few claimed they'd had similar experiences, that they'd heard the hum or seen the lights or been pulled into situations they couldn't explain. None of it could be verified. None of it was proven. But in June of 2023, 4 years after Jack's disappearance, commercial satellite imagery of Groom Lake revealed something new. A scar in the desert floor, roughly 600 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, the sand fused into glass. The heat required to create that kind of vitrification was estimated at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. No known aircraft or weapon system could generate that kind of focused thermal energy. The government offered no explanation. When journalists asked about the scar, Air Force spokespeople repeated the standard line: "We don't discuss operations at testing facilities." The scar is still there, visible in satellite images for anyone with an internet connection to see. It sits in the desert like a punctuation mark, the period at the end of a sentence that was never finished. Ending. The desert still breathes. Area 51 began as a runway for spy planes. The U-2, the Oxcart, the Blackbird, aircraft so advanced they seemed like science fiction, even to the pilots who flew them. Later came stealth technology, drones, hypersonic vehicles, each generation pushing further into realms that most people assumed were impossible. But maybe, just maybe, some of what they were testing out there wasn't built in Lockheed's Skunk Works or Northrop's Black Projects division. Maybe some of it was recovered, studied, reverse engineered from something that came from somewhere else. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe Area 51 is exactly what the government says it is. A test facility for classified aircraft, nothing more. Maybe all the lights in the sky are ours. All the strange radar returns are experimental craft. All the stories are just that. Stories told by people who saw something they couldn't explain and filled in the gaps with their imaginations. But if that's true, then why the secrecy that persists decades after the Cold War ended? Why the lawsuits that get dismissed on national security grounds? Why the satellite photos showing construction that doesn't match any known industrial purpose? Why the scar in the desert fused into glass by heat that shouldn't exist? Jack Reeves drove freight through the Nevada desert for over a decade. He was a reliable contractor, a man who followed rules and kept his mouth shut. Until the night he didn't come home, until the night he left his truck running on an empty highway and walked into the darkness. They say the desert keeps its secrets, that the sand and the wind erase everything eventually, grinding down evidence and memory until nothing remains but stories. But the desert isn't empty. It's full of things we built and things we found and things we still don't understand. And somewhere out there, beneath runways and hangars and tunnels that don't appear on any map, something is still humming, still waiting, still watching the skies for signals we can't interpret and responding in ways we're not equipped to comprehend. Area 51 is real. The documents prove it. The satellites show it. The history confirms it. What happens inside is another question. And maybe, just maybe, the answer is something we're not ready to hear. Area 51 remains an active United States Air Force operating location. Public access is prohibited. No evidence of extraterrestrial technology has ever been officially released. The lights over Groom Lake continue to appear, the hum continues to resonate, and somewhere in the desert beneath the stars the frequency still broadcasts. For those who know how to listen,